I was almost asleep when the doorbell rang. My son and his wife showed up with 2 designer suitcases. We are moving in. Then my daughter-in-law handed me a typed list of rules. Breakfast ready by 7 in the morning. Bathrooms cleaned every night. Shirts pressed. Dresses hung not folded. I simply smiled. At 7 the next morning, the adjustment began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Hollis. I am 69 years old, and what I'm about to tell you changed my family forever. The clock on my nightstand glowed midnight when the frantic pounding on the front door jolted me awake. I threw on my robe and walked down the hallway of the home my late wife Corinne and I built together in Atlanta. When I opened the door, the crisp night air rushed in, bringing my 34-year-old son Jordan and his 31-year-old wife Harper with it. Jordan stood on the porch, his eyes glued to the wooden floorboards, gripping the handles of 2 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. His shoulders were slumped, completely lacking the pride I had tried to instill in him since he was a boy. Harper brushed past me without a word of greeting. She stepped into my foyer in her expensive trench coat and immediately began scanning the modest surroundings with absolute disgust. She eyed the vintage floral wallpaper Corinne had picked out and audibly scoffed. She muttered that the house smelled like old wood and stale memories. Jordan finally stepped inside, refusing to meet my gaze. He dropped the heavy bags onto the floor with a loud thud and quietly announced they were moving in for a while. There was no explanation, no apology for the intrusion, and no respect for the man who owned the property. I stood there, a 69-year-old retired mechanical engineer, watching my own flesh and blood treat my sanctuary like a cheap motel. Harper kicked off her heels, leaving them right in the middle of the walkway, and loudly complained about the humidity. She did not ask where she would be sleeping. She simply pointed toward the master bedroom down the hall and told Jordan to carry her bags. I remained completely silent, observing the blatant disrespect unfolding in my own home. Before Jordan could even lift the bags, Harper turned around and reached into her designer purse. She pulled out a neatly folded piece of crisp white paper and shoved it directly against my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. She looked me up and down and spoke with a slow, exaggerated tone, articulating every syllable as if she were addressing a toddler or a slow-witted servant. She told me that since they would be staying here, we needed to establish some ground rules to maintain her standard of living. I unfolded the paper. It was a typed schedule of household chores assigned exclusively to me. Breakfast had to be ready and set on the dining table exactly at 7 in the morning. The guest bathrooms required a deep cleaning every single night. Jordan's dress shirts needed to be hand-pressed with heavy starch. Her dresses were to be hung on padded hangers, absolutely never folded. She crossed her arms and demanded a fresh pot of French roast coffee and a spinach omelet immediately because the drive had exhausted her. The sheer audacity of her demands hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jordan stood entirely mute, staring at the wall, allowing his wife to reduce his father to an unpaid butler. Corinne and I had worked our entire lives to provide him with a top-tier education, hoping he would grow into a strong, independent man. Instead, he had become a silent accomplice to his wife's staggering entitlement. Harper snapped her fingers, instructing me to hurry up with the food because her blood sugar was dropping. I looked at the typed list, then at my son, and finally at her. I simply smiled, offering no verbal confirmation or protest. I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the hall, clutching the crisp sheet of paper. I did not head toward the kitchen to crack eggs or brew coffee. Instead, I walked directly into my home office. This was the room where I had spent decades drafting blueprints and calculating mechanical tolerances, eventually securing the automotive patents that built my quiet fortune. I approached the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to my desk. I flicked the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, steady growl. Without a second thought, I dropped Harper's typed list of demands straight into the metal teeth. I watched the blades pull the paper down, slicing her arrogant rules into hundreds of worthless ribbons. The sound was incredibly satisfying. I turned off the machine and walked back out to the hallway. I bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the kitchen. I flipped the main breaker switch for the kitchen lights, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I then walked over to the large walk-in pantry where I kept all the premium groceries and supplies. I pulled a heavy industrial padlock from my pocket, secured the iron latch on the pantry door, and snapped it shut with a loud echoing click. I was not about to argue with an entitled guest in the middle of the night. I was going to establish my own boundaries through undeniable actions. I slipped the brass key into my robe pocket and walked back toward the foyer. The house was dead quiet save for the sound of my slippers against the hardwood floor. I was preparing to show them that disrespecting a man in his own castle carried an immediate non-negotiable cost. A piercing scream of pure frustration shattered the midnight quiet. Harper had walked into the pitch-black kitchen and blindly discovered the heavy metal padlock barring her from the pantry. Jordan came storming down the hallway, his face flushed with sudden anger, demanding to know what I was doing. He confronted me near the staircase, raising his voice to accuse me of being completely unreasonable. I looked my son dead in the eye, maintaining a calm, unwavering posture. I told them the kitchen was closed for the night and suggested they use their phones to order takeout if they were hungry. Jordan opened his mouth to argue, but the icy resolve in my gaze made his words catch in his throat. He backed down, muttering under his breath, and retreated to calm his furious wife. I turned around and walked quietly into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I knew the conflict was far from over. Infuriated by my blatant defiance, Harper refused to accept defeat. She needed to assert her dominance and punish me for denying her commands. While I lay in bed, she crept silently through the dark house, seeking a way to retaliate. She slipped past my locked door and snuck directly into my home office. She rummaged through my desk drawers until her hands found exactly what she was looking for. She snatched the heavy set of keys to my prized possession, a vintage, fully restored classic truck parked in the driveway. She had no idea that the vehicle was not just a piece of metal, but a registered corporate asset tightly bound by legal protections. Her arrogant desire for petty revenge had just set a massive, devastating trap into motion, and she was walking right into it. The morning sunlight pierced through the blinds, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor. I walked downstairs at precisely 6 o'clock, the exact time I always started my day. The house was dead quiet. Jordan and Harper were still asleep, entirely oblivious to the schedule they had attempted to force upon me the night before. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and walked out to the front porch to check the driveway. My vintage restored truck was gone. The empty space on the concrete spoke volumes about my daughter-in-law's entitlement. A lesser man might have panicked or stormed down the hall to pound on their bedroom door. I did neither. I did not bother calling Jordan to ask where his wife had taken my property. I walked calmly back into my study, set my coffee mug on the desk, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the tracking software I had personally installed in the dashboard years ago. The glowing red dot on the screen showed the vehicle moving smoothly down the interstate toward the upscale shopping district on the north side of the city. I picked up my phone and dialed the local police precinct. I informed the dispatcher that my vehicle had been stolen from my driveway during the night. I provided the exact make, model, year, and license plate number. I then read off the precise GPS coordinates updating live on my screen. The dispatcher asked if I knew who might have taken the car. I answered with complete honesty that an unauthorized individual had removed the keys from my private office without my consent. The police assured me they would intercept the vehicle immediately. I thanked them, hung up the phone, and took another sip of my coffee. Across town, Harper was cruising through the heart of the luxury retail district, blissfully unaware of the trap she had triggered. She parked right in front of a high-end boutique, preparing to spend money her husband did not actually have. Before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the morning calm. 3 police cruisers converged on the street, blocking the truck from every possible angle. Officers jumped out with their hands resting firmly on their holsters, shouting clear commands for the driver to exit the vehicle with her hands raised. Harper froze in absolute shock. The officers did not care about her designer trench coat or her manicured appearance. They barked the orders again, forcing her to step out onto the busy pavement. 2 officers grabbed her arms, spun her around against the side of the truck, and locked cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. Harper completely lost her mind. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding the officers let her go because she came from a wealthy and important family. Her arrogant screams only drew more attention from the growing crowd of wealthy shoppers. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalks, pulling out their smartphones to record the spectacle of a hysterical woman being aggressively detained in broad daylight. She yelled that she was merely driving her father-in-law's car, entirely blind to the fact that her public humiliation was the direct consequence of her own unhinged arrogance. The police officers simply read her Miranda rights, placed a hand on the top of her head, and shoved her into the back of a squad car. The heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping her inside the consequences of her own actions, while dozens of cameras captured her complete social ruin. The front door of my house flew open with a violent crash that rattled the picture frames on the hallway walls. Jordan stormed into the foyer, his face contorted with a mixture of profound embarrassment and explosive rage. He had spent the last 4 hours sitting in a bleak police precinct waiting room, forced to drain his rapidly dwindling bank account to post bail for his furious wife. Harper followed closely behind him, her face stained with ruined makeup and tears of pure humiliation. She stormed straight into the guest bedroom and slammed the door with a deafening thud. Jordan marched directly into my study, slamming his fists down onto the surface of my desk. He screamed that I had completely lost my mind. He accused me of deliberately humiliating his wife and attempting to destroy their marriage over a simple misunderstanding. I remained completely seated, meeting his furious gaze with absolute stillness. Jordan pointed a trembling finger at my chest, lowering his voice into a vicious, desperate threat. He told me that my false police report was all the proof he needed to demonstrate that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He swore he would call an attorney first thing in the morning to have me declared legally incompetent. He threatened to strip away my autonomy, seize control of the entire estate, and lock me inside a bleak, state-run nursing home for the rest of my natural life. He thought his aggressive posturing would force me into immediate submission. He assumed I would cower and apologize to save my own skin. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a single, neatly folded legal document to silence him. The true game had just begun. I slid the crisp paper across the mahogany wood directly toward Jordan. It was the official corporate registration for the vintage truck. I calmly explained that the vehicle did not belong to me personally. The truck was officially registered to a limited liability company I established decades ago to manage my automotive patents. My late wife, Corinne, always insisted on shielding our hard-earned assets from frivolous lawsuits, a brilliant lesson I took to heart. By taking the keys without authorization from a corporate officer, Harper had committed grand theft auto against a protected corporate entity. The police arrest was flawlessly executed and entirely legal. Jordan stared at the document, the color completely draining from his face as the reality of my unshakable legal protections set in. He realized he could not intimidate me or weaponize the law against me because I had already anticipated his moves. Defeated and severely humiliated, he backed out of my study without saying another word. Later that afternoon, I grabbed my heavy coat and left the house to purchase some fresh groceries. I knew exactly what would happen the moment my car pulled out of the driveway. Extreme desperation breeds absolute recklessness. Jordan watched from the upstairs window until my vehicle disappeared around the corner. He knew his financial situation was rapidly collapsing, and he desperately needed heavy leverage to survive the mounting debts he was hiding. The moment the house was silent, Jordan crept down the hallway and slipped quietly into my master bedroom. He locked the door behind him and immediately began tearing the room apart, ripping up the heavy wool carpets and throwing clothes out of the closet in a frantic search to locate my hidden floor safe. I pulled my truck into the driveway 2 hours earlier than usual. The morning air was crisp, but a heavy sense of anticipation settled over me. I had run my errands quickly, specifically to see what would happen in my absence. I did not walk through the front door immediately. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the security application I had linked to the hidden cameras inside my home. The screen flickered to life, showing a clear, high-definition view of my master bedroom. Jordan was inside. He had locked the door, isolating himself in the sanctuary I had shared with Corinne for over 3 decades. He was on his knees in front of my closet, having torn up the heavy wool carpet to expose the floorboards. His hands were working frantically, gripping the dial of the heavy steel safe embedded in the concrete foundation. I watched him spin the dial left and right, his face a mask of desperation and intense frustration. He tried a series of combinations, inputting birth dates, anniversaries, and old addresses, hoping to strike lucky. The safe remained completely locked. Jordan wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His movements became more aggressive as failure set in. He pounded his fist against the solid steel door, a silent scream escaping his lips. I watched my son, the boy I had taught to build models and respect hard work, attempting to steal from his own father. The betrayal was no longer just an attitude. It was a physical action captured in real time. I turned off the engine of my truck and sat in the quiet cab, observing every movement he made, gathering the evidence I needed to completely dismantle whatever scheme he was trying to execute. Jordan finally gave up on the safe. He stood up, his chest heaving with exertion and pure rage. He grabbed his designer jacket, which he had carelessly thrown across my bed earlier. He yanked it violently off the mattress, a gesture of pure frustration. As he pulled the jacket through the air, something slipped from the inner breast pocket. A thick, heavy stack of tri-folded letters tumbled out, hitting the plush rug with a soft thud. Jordan was too consumed by his anger and his failure to notice the drop. He shoved his arms into the sleeves, muttered something unintelligible under his breath, and stormed out of the bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. I waited in the truck for exactly 5 minutes, ensuring he had returned to the living room. I quietly opened the front door and stepped inside my house. The silence felt heavy, charged with the tension of an impending storm. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and entered my bedroom. The room was a complete disaster, but my eyes were fixed on the small white bundle resting on the floor near the foot of the bed. I walked over, crouched down, and picked up the stack of letters. The paper felt thick and official. The return addresses immediately caught my attention. They were not from luxury retailers or high-end boutiques. They were from aggressive collection agencies, high-risk financial institutions, and law firms specializing in debt recovery. I unfolded the top letter and began to read. The words printed on the page were absolute poison, revealing a reality that Jordan had desperately tried to conceal behind his expensive clothes and arrogant demeanor. The letters detailed a financial catastrophe of massive proportions. The first document was a final notice of foreclosure on the luxury condominium Jordan and Harper had purchased 3 years ago. The bank was initiating immediate seizure of the property due to 6 months of unpaid mortgage installments. The second letter was a demand for payment from a predatory loan company known for its ruthless collection tactics. The outstanding balance was a staggering $80,000, accumulating a predatory interest rate that made repayment impossible. The third letter was a threatening correspondence from a private creditor explicitly warning of severe legal and personal consequences if the debt was not settled by the end of the month. The truth crashed over me like a tidal wave. Jordan was completely, utterly bankrupt. He had drained every account and exhausted every line of credit in a desperate attempt to fund Harper's lavish, superficial lifestyle. He had purchased the designer clothes, the luxury cars, and the expensive vacations using borrowed money he could never repay. They had not moved into my home to visit, to reconnect, or to save money. They had moved in because they were quite literally running from the consequences of their massive financial fraud. My home was their final refuge, a desperate attempt to hide from the creditors actively hunting them down. The realization sickened me. My son had allowed his arrogant wife to push him into a financial abyss, and now he intended to use my lifelong security to dig himself out. I folded the letters carefully and slipped them into my pocket. The situation was far more dangerous than simple disrespect. It was a matter of sheer survival for them, which meant they would stop at nothing to get their hands on my assets. I stood in the center of my bedroom, the gravity of Jordan's desperation settling firmly in my mind. He was not just an entitled son looking for a handout. He was a desperate man cornered by dangerous creditors. I knew exactly what he was looking for in that safe. He wanted the physical deed to the house. He intended to use my property as collateral to secure another massive loan or forge a quick sale to pay off his debts. He was planning to steal my home right out from under me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and immediately dialed the direct line to my attorney, Mr. Caldwell. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Caldwell the situation had escalated from a family dispute to a direct financial threat. I instructed him to immediately initiate the transfer of the property deed into an invisible, impenetrable corporate trust. I wanted the ownership completely shielded, buried under layers of legal protection that Jordan could never access or manipulate. Caldwell understood the urgency perfectly. He assured me the paperwork would be drafted and filed within 48 hours, making it impossible for anyone to use the property as collateral without authorization from a designated trustee board. I hung up the phone and looked around my chaotic bedroom. I had secured my most valuable asset, placing it far out of Jordan's desperate reach. I walked over to the closet and meticulously replaced the torn carpet, hiding any evidence that the safe had been disturbed. I smoothed the bedsheets and walked out of the room, ready to face the two parasites living under my roof. I knew their desperation would soon force them into a fatal mistake. The following evening, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed loudly through the hallway. I had not been informed of any upcoming visitors. I walked to the foyer and found Harper opening the front door with a wide, theatrical smile. Standing on my porch were her parents, a wealthy, arrogant white couple who had never bothered to visit Corinne and me during our 30 years of marriage. Her father wore a tailored linen suit, and her mother clutched a designer handbag as if it were a shield against our neighborhood. They stepped over the threshold and immediately began scanning my home with looks of absolute disgust. Her mother wrinkled her nose at the original oak wainscoting, loudly commenting on the musty smell of the antique furnishings. Harper did not introduce me or offer an apology for the unannounced intrusion. Instead, she turned to me and snapped her fingers sharply. She handed me a heavy silver corkscrew and instructed me to fetch the vintage Bordeaux from the kitchen. She explicitly told me to make sure the glasses were polished perfectly and to serve them in the formal dining room, speaking to me exactly as one would address a hired caterer. Jordan stood silently in the corner, adjusting his collar and refusing to meet my gaze. He was actively allowing his wife to degrade his father in his own home to impress her elite parents. I took the corkscrew from her hand. I did not argue or raise my voice to defend my pride. I simply nodded and walked toward the kitchen. Let them believe they had reduced me to a servant. Their arrogance was blinding them to the harsh reality of the situation. I was not fetching their wine out of submission. I was preparing to gather the intelligence I needed. I carried a silver tray holding the open bottle and 4 crystal glasses into the dining room. Harper and her parents had already seated themselves at the head of my table. As I poured the dark red liquid, Harper's father leaned back in his chair and began dismantling my home with his words. He pointed toward the load-bearing walls and confidently declared that they would need to gut the entire first floor to modernize the suffocating layout. He spoke enthusiastically about tearing out the handcrafted mahogany staircase Corinne had loved so dearly, casually replacing it with industrial steel and glass. He then looked directly at me while I poured his wine. He spoke slowly and loudly, assuming my age had somehow damaged my hearing and my intellect. He told me it was a real shame I had never learned the true value of a modern, open aesthetic, patting my arm with extreme condescension. He praised Jordan for finally taking the initiative to upgrade the property. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I stepped back into the shadows of the dining room and stood attentively against the wall. They completely ignored my presence, treating me as a piece of invisible furniture. What they did not know was that my mobile phone was resting quietly in my breast pocket. The green recording indicator was flashing steadily in the dark. The high-definition microphone was capturing every single arrogant insult and every piece of their destructive plan. I allowed them to talk freely. The more comfortable they felt in their superiority, the more they revealed their true intentions. I listened carefully to their cruel laughter, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment when their overconfidence would cause them to make a fatal mistake. The evening wore on and the heavy vintage wine flowed freely. Jordan drank significantly more than the others, clearly using the alcohol to numb his mounting anxiety. His cheeks flushed dark and his posture grew increasingly sloppy. Harper's mother raised her crystal glass, asking Jordan exactly when the renovation crews could begin the extensive demolition work. Jordan smiled a foolish, drunken smile. He leaned forward and assured his wealthy in-laws that the contractors could start by next week without any issues. He proudly announced that the final property deed transfer paperwork would be completely finalized by this coming Friday. The dining room fell completely silent for a fraction of a second. Harper kicked Jordan sharply under the table, her eyes widening in sudden panic. She quickly tried to change the subject by talking about a luxurious European vacation, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, captured perfectly on my hidden recording device. My mind raced, processing the massive implication of what my son had just confessed. A property deed transfer requires the physical signature of the current legal owner in front of a registered notary. I had not signed a single piece of paper, nor had I authorized any transfer of my assets to anyone. The realization was cold and terrifying. Jordan and Harper were actively forging my signature on official state real estate documents. They were not merely waiting for me to succumb to old age, they were orchestrating a massive immediate fraud to steal my home before the week ended. I quietly retreated into the kitchen to wash the remaining dishes. My son had crossed a severe legal line from which he could never return. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky. Jordan and Harper slept in late, exhausted from their evening of arrogance and heavy drinking. I stepped out onto the porch at exactly 8 o'clock to collect the daily mail. I sorted through the stack of letters and flyers. Wedged between 2 grocery catalogs was a thick envelope from my primary bank, but it was addressed directly to Jordan. My instincts sharpened immediately. Jordan had no authorized connection to my primary financial accounts. I carried the envelope down to my basement workshop far away from their sleeping quarters. Using a sharp utility knife, I carefully sliced the top edge of the envelope open. I pulled out the monthly statement. As I unfolded the paper, a physical copy of a cleared check fell onto my workbench. I picked up the small rectangular slip and examined it under the harsh fluorescent light. It was a check drawn directly from my personal checking account, made out to cash for the staggering amount of $10,000. I looked at the bottom right corner of the paper. There, written in smooth black ink, was my exact signature. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception, mimicking the precise loops and slants I had used for decades. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed this check. Jordan had drained $10,000 of my hard-earned money to feed the ruthless creditors hunting him down. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a cold, calculated fury settle deep into my bones. They had stolen my truck, humiliated me in my own home, and now they were actively looting my life savings. They believed they were untouchable. They had no idea I was about to freeze their entire world. Hollis parked his sedan outside the First National Bank branch downtown, his grip firm on the steering wheel. He walked through the heavy glass doors with absolute purpose, bypassing the teller line entirely and heading straight for the branch manager's office. Mr. Evans had handled the family finances for over 2 decades and knew Hollis very well. Hollis sat across the polished desk and placed the physical copy of the cleared check directly in front of the manager. He calmly asked Mr. Evans to explain exactly how a $10,000 withdrawal was authorized without his physical presence. Mr. Evans adjusted his glasses and shifted in his leather chair, looking visibly uncomfortable. He explained that Jordan had come in late yesterday afternoon carrying the fully endorsed check. Jordan had spun a highly convincing and emotional tale for the bank staff. He claimed that Hollis was suffering from severe joint pain and was simply too frail to make the trip downtown himself. Jordan had insisted the money was desperately needed to pay for emergency medical equipment to make the old house accessible for his rapidly declining father. Mr. Evans apologized profusely, stating that since Jordan was a direct family member and the signature matched the system records perfectly, they had processed the transaction to be helpful. Hollis listened to this sickening fabrication without showing a single shred of emotion. His own son was not merely stealing his money, but actively building a false public narrative of physical decline to justify his crimes. The theft was bad enough, but weaponizing Hollis's age to facilitate fraud crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Hollis nodded slowly, thanking Mr. Evans for his transparency. He did not yell or threaten to sue the bank. He remained perfectly composed. Instead of making a scene, Hollis executed a brilliantly calculated strike. He leaned forward and instructed Mr. Evans to immediately close all access to the primary checking and savings accounts. He invoked the secure trust protocol he had finalized with Mr. Caldwell just days prior. Hollis ordered the immediate transfer of every single dollar investment bond and liquid asset into the newly established impenetrable trust account. He made it explicitly clear that no one, especially not Jordan or Harper, was permitted to access these funds under any circumstances without his direct in-person authorization. Mr. Evans typed furiously on his keyboard, pulling up the complex legal frameworks Mr. Caldwell had already filed with the bank's legal department. The transfer required a series of security verifications which Hollis passed with razor-sharp precision, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his mind was flawlessly intact. As the system processed the massive transfer, Hollis gave one final specific instruction. He told the manager not to close the old joint checking account entirely. Instead, he ordered Mr. Evans to leave exactly 42 cents in the original account. This was the account linked to the credit and debit cards Jordan and Harper had been freely swiping since they arrived. Hollis wanted the account to remain technically active so the impending rejections would hit them directly at the point of sale. Mr. Evans confirmed the massive transfer was complete and the old account balance was locked at 42 cents. Hollis stood up, shook the manager's hand, and walked out of the bank into the bright morning sunlight. The financial umbilical cord was now completely severed. He had just detonated a silent bomb under his son's lavish lifestyle, and the shockwave was about to hit. At that exact moment, Harper was lounging in a plush silk robe at an exclusive downtown wellness spa. She had invited 3 of her equally arrogant friends for a full day of deep tissue massages, mud wraps, and expensive champagne, fully intending to bill the entire luxurious experience to Hollis's account. They laughed loudly, clinking their crystal flutes and gossiping about their upscale neighborhoods, entirely oblivious to the financial ruin looming over Harper's head. When the spa day concluded, Harper strutted up to the marble reception desk to settle the massive bill. She casually reached into her designer purse and pulled out the joint credit card linked directly to Hollis's old primary account. She handed it to the receptionist with a smug smile, bragging to her friends about treating them to the extravagant getaway. The receptionist swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped harshly, displaying a bright red error message. The receptionist politely informed Harper that the card had been declined and asked if she had an alternative payment method. Harper's smug smile vanished instantly. She scoffed loudly, blaming the machine for being faulty, and demanded the receptionist run the card again. The woman complied, but the machine issued the same aggressive rejection. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the reception area. Harper's wealthy friends stopped laughing and began whispering among themselves, casting judgmental glances at Harper's suddenly pale face. Panic set in as Harper frantically dug through her purse for another card, knowing full well that every account Jordan owned was completely maxed out. With a line forming behind her and her friends actively mocking her humiliation, Harper was forced to unbuckle her solid gold designer watch. She handed it to the receptionist as collateral, vowing furiously to return with the cash. Harper stormed through the front door of the house less than an hour later, shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. She found Hollis sitting calmly in his leather reading chair, quietly reviewing an engineering journal. She marched directly into the living room and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She wildly accused Hollis of hiding the family money and deliberately humiliating her in front of her high society friends. She demanded to know why the credit cards were suddenly frozen and where he had moved the funds. Hollis slowly lowered his journal. He looked up at her with eyes as sharp and cold as cut glass. He calmly stated that he had absolutely no obligation to fund the luxurious lifestyle of thieves and trespassers. He told her she would have to pawn the rest of her jewelry if she wanted to continue drinking imported champagne. In that chilling moment, Harper stared at the man sitting before her. She finally realized that Hollis was not a frail, confused old man waiting to be pushed aside. He was entirely lucid, incredibly dangerous, and actively fighting back with terrifying precision. Her arrogant threats held absolutely no power over him. Panic mixed with vicious determination as Harper retreated into the hallway. If they could not legally seize the money while Hollis was competent, they would have to forcibly manufacture his decline. She reached deep into the side pocket of her designer bag and pulled out a heavy glass bottle. It was a prescription of powerful, mind-altering sedatives she had secretly acquired. She gripped the bottle tightly, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She decided that if Hollis refused to act like a crazy old man, she was going to make sure he looked completely insane to the rest of the world. Harper waited until the house fell completely silent before making her quiet move. She slipped out of her bedroom and crept down the hallway toward the kitchen, clutching the heavy glass bottle of sedatives tightly against her chest. The polished hardwood floors masked her footsteps as she approached the kitchen island. She knew Hollis kept his daily medication organized in a weekly pill dispenser next to the coffee maker. She quickly located the plastic container and popped open the compartment marked for Wednesday morning. Inside rested 2 clear capsules filled with a stark white powder, his prescribed blood pressure medication. Harper moved with frantic, malicious energy. She emptied the contents of his capsules directly into the sink and washed the powder down the drain. She then took 2 of the heavy sedatives from her bottle and placed them into a heavy ceramic mortar she found in the pantry. Using the pestle, she crushed the dense pills, grinding them repeatedly until they dissolved into a fine, chalky dust. Her breathing was shallow and rapid as she carefully scooped the newly pulverized sedatives and packed the powder into Hollis's empty clear capsules. She snapped the plastic halves back together, ensuring they looked completely undisturbed. She placed the tampered capsules back into the Wednesday slot and closed the lid with a soft click. She wiped down the counter to remove any trace of the chalky residue. Harper smiled in the dim light, entirely convinced she had executed the perfect sabotage. She believed these heavy tranquilizers would completely destroy his daily cognitive function, making him appear severely disoriented and entirely incapable of managing his own affairs. She then wiped her hands on a towel and sneaked back to her bedroom, leaving the trap fully armed and waiting for the bright morning sun to rise. What Harper did not realize was that the kitchen was fully equipped with the same high-definition security cameras that monitored the rest of the estate. Hollis lay awake in his bed, holding his phone in the darkness. He watched the live video feed with a cold, analytical precision. The narrative of his life had always been governed by absolute accuracy. Hollis was a highly successful retired mechanical engineer. He had spent 4 decades designing complex, high-precision automotive components, securing lucrative patents that demanded absolute perfection down to the microscopic level. His entire career was built on identifying structural flaws and minuscule irregularities that other people completely missed. He observed Harper crushing the pills on his kitchen counter, treating his personal medication like a weapon. The moment she left the room, Hollis stood up and walked silently down the hall. He approached the pill dispenser and opened the Wednesday compartment. He lifted the 2 capsules into the moonlight filtering through the window. To a normal person, the white powder inside looked exactly the same. But Hollis possessed an exceptionally trained eye. He immediately noticed the microscopic difference in the chemical composition. His original blood pressure medication had a faint, almost imperceptible crystalline sheen. The powder Harper had packed inside was a dull, chalky, dense white. He knew instantly that swallowing these pills would introduce a massive dose of heavy narcotics into his system. He carefully placed the capsules back into the container, analyzing his next strategic move. He understood that Jordan and Harper needed him to appear mentally incompetent to execute their fraudulent deed transfer. If he confronted them now, they would simply deny everything and formulate a new, more dangerous attack. Instead, Hollis decided to use their own malicious trap against them. He prepared to deliver a masterclass in deception. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Hollis walked into the kitchen wearing his usual attire. Jordan and Harper were already sitting at the dining table, sipping their coffee and watching him with intense, predatory anticipation. Hollis approached the counter and opened his pill dispenser. He smoothly palmed the 2 tampered capsules, slipping them into the deep pocket of his trousers, while simultaneously raising a glass of water to his lips. He mimed a swallowing motion and let out a soft sigh, setting the empty glass down on the marble surface. Harper exchanged a sharp, victorious glance with Jordan. They waited in absolute suffocating silence for the heavy sedatives to take control of his nervous system. Hollis decided to give them exactly the performance they desperately wanted to see. 10 minutes later, he stood up to walk toward the living room. He intentionally allowed his left leg to drag across the hardwood floor, faking a sudden and severe loss of motor control. He let his shoulders slump and his eyes glaze over, staring blankly at the wall. As he passed the side table, he reached out with a trembling hand and deliberately knocked over a heavy brass reading lamp. It crashed to the floor, shattering the bulb. Jordan jumped up from his chair, rushing into the room. Hollis staggered backward, feigning severe disorientation and extreme confusion. He slurred his words, muttering nonsensical phrases about blueprint dimensions from 40 years ago. He deliberately allowed his knees to buckle under his own weight, collapsing heavily onto the soft cushions of the living room couch. He closed his eyes and let his head loll to the side, his breathing slow and exaggerated. Harper stood in the doorway, a wicked smile spreading across her face. Their exceptionally cruel plan appeared to be working perfectly. Believing that the heavy sedatives had completely neutralized his father's remaining mental capacity, Jordan wasted absolutely no time putting the next phase of his scheme into motion. He pulled his mobile phone from his dark jacket pocket and quickly stepped out onto the back patio to ensure complete privacy. Hollis remained perfectly still on the couch, keeping his breathing slow and rhythmic while listening intently through the open sliding glass door. Jordan frantically scrolled through his contacts until he found a specific number. He dialed and waited, pacing nervously across the wooden deck. He did not call a legitimate medical professional or a respected neurologist. Instead, Jordan contacted a disgraced black market doctor who was notorious for supplying fraudulent medical certificates to desperate clients for exorbitant cash fees. Jordan spoke in a hushed, urgent tone, demanding that the man come directly to the house at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. He explicitly explained that he needed immediate, absolutely airtight paperwork officially declaring his father legally incompetent to manage his own financial estate. The doctor on the other end of the line hesitated, demanding a massive premium for the short notice and the high legal risk. Jordan readily agreed, promising to pay the man $5,000 in cash the moment the fraudulent medical evaluation was signed and sealed. He hung up the phone with a deep sigh of relief, fully convinced he had successfully orchestrated the perfect legal takeover of his father's fortune. Jordan walked back inside the house, grinning as he looked down at Hollis, resting silently on the couch. What Jordan completely failed to realize then was that Hollis was not sedated in the slightest. His mind was razor-sharp, and the devastating trap he was building around his son had just firmly locked into its final, inescapable position. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck exactly 8 in the morning when the heavy brass doorbell chimed. Jordan rushed to open the front door with an eagerness that betrayed his extreme desperation. He ushered a tall, sharply dressed man into the formal living room. The stranger carried a pristine leather briefcase and wore a massive gold watch that caught the morning light. He introduced himself as Dr. Vance, a renowned specialist in geriatric cognitive decline. I remained seated on the living room couch, maintaining the perfect illusion of a frail, heavily medicated old man. Dr. Vance took the armchair directly across from me, unclasped his briefcase, and pulled out a sleek silver pen. Jordan and Harper positioned themselves in the background, standing shoulder to shoulder near the dining room threshold. They watched the scene unfold with barely contained excitement, grinning with the anticipation of impending victory. The fake doctor leaned forward, adopting a slow, sickeningly sweet tone usually reserved for placating frightened children. He began the evaluation by asking a series of deliberately confusing and patronizing questions. He asked me to identify the current day of the week, but intentionally twisted his words to make the inquiry sound incredibly complex. He held up 3 fingers and asked me to count backward from 100 by intervals of 7, speaking loudly, as if my hearing were completely gone. He then asked me to explain the basic functions of my daily routine, phrasing the questions to imply I was entirely incapable of managing my own life. Harper crossed her arms, her smug smile widening with every condescending syllable that fell from his lips. They were all absolutely convinced that I was utterly lost in a thick chemical fog, fully ready to be effortlessly pushed into a bleak state-run nursing facility today. I allowed Dr. Vance to finish his patronizing assessment before I completely dropped the facade. I sat up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back and locking my eyes directly onto his. The sudden shift in my posture was physical, replacing the frail old man with the commanding presence of a chief mechanical engineer. I answered his ridiculous questions with terrifying, absolute clarity. I did not just tell him the current date. I seamlessly recited the exact Julian calendar algorithm used to calculate the leap year cycle. When he asked me to count backward, I instead provided the precise mathematical formula for calculating the structural load-bearing capacity of a reinforced steel automotive chassis, rattling off complex equations without pausing for a single breath. The doctor stopped writing immediately. His sleek silver pen hovered awkwardly over his pristine notepad. The arrogant, sickeningly sweet smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. He glanced nervously over his shoulder at Jordan and Harper, desperately seeking some kind of explanation for this radical transformation. Harper dropped her arms, her smug expression shattering into genuine confusion. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and shifted the conversation away from mathematics. I looked Dr. Vance dead in the eye and began reciting the exact legal definitions of medical fraud under federal law. I clearly outlined all the severe criminal penalties associated with providing a falsified psychiatric evaluation for financial compensation. I detailed the specific mandatory minimum prison sentences for corrupt conspirators attempting to forcibly institutionalize a perfectly competent senior citizen today. The atmosphere in the massive living room suddenly grew incredibly cold. The fake doctor began to sweat profusely, visibly swallowing hard, as he realized he had walked blindly into a highly calculated, meticulously planned, and incredibly dangerous trap. Before Dr. Vance could utter a single word in his own defense, I calmly reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out a small, high-definition Bluetooth speaker and placed it deliberately in the dead center of the glass coffee table. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, syncing the device with a quiet beep. Jordan finally stepped forward from the dining room threshold, his voice shaking as he demanded to know exactly what I was doing. I ignored him completely and pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio of Jordan's frantic phone call from the patio the previous morning instantly filled the silent living room. The recording captured every desperate word perfectly. The speaker broadcasted Jordan explicitly negotiating the illegal $5,000 cash bribe. It played the exact moment he ordered Dr. Vance to fabricate the necessary paperwork to declare me legally incompetent regardless of my actual cognitive health. The high-quality microphone had even picked up the doctor's hesitant voice on the other end of the line, clearly agreeing to accept the massive premium for executing the fraudulent medical evaluation. Jordan froze in pure shock, all the color draining entirely from his face as he listened to his own damning confession echoing off the walls. Harper gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands in absolute terror. Dr. Vance stared at the speaker with wide, panicked eyes, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. The audio clip unequivocally detailed their entire coordinated conspiracy to commit federal medical fraud and elder abuse. I let the recording play until the final sickening agreement was reached. I tapped my screen again to stop the playback, letting a heavy, suffocating silence fall over the room. The undisputed evidence of their highly illegal criminal collusion was now completely exposed today. The fake doctor was the very first to react to the overwhelming threat of federal prison. Dr. Vance grabbed his pristine leather briefcase from the floor with visibly trembling hands, completely abandoning his sleek silver pen on my coffee table. He did not say a single word or offer a pathetic apology. He simply turned around and sprinted out the front door in absolute, unadulterated terror, leaving my house as fast as his legs could carry him. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him, echoing loudly through the tense foyer. Jordan stood frozen for another long moment before his fear rapidly mutated into an uncontrollable, explosive rage. He grabbed an expensive ceramic vase from the nearby console table and hurled it violently against the brick fireplace. The ceramic shattered into hundreds of jagged pieces, raining sharp shrapnel across the hardwood floor. He screamed at the top of his lungs, a primal sound of utter defeat and profound desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of familial respect. Jordan viciously declared that he would absolutely secure the property deed to this house by any means necessary. He shouted that he no longer cared about playing legal games or utilizing fake medical professionals to seize the estate. His massive financial debts were closing in rapidly, and the luxury facade he had built for Harper was completely crumbling around him. Realizing that the medical incompetency route was now permanently destroyed by my undeniable audio evidence, Jordan made a fatal, reckless decision. He turned to Harper and aggressively announced that they were completely out of time. He decided to finally bypass the careful legal theft entirely and instead go straight to the violent local loan sharks to illegally leverage his massive future inheritance immediately today. The sharp metallic click of the front door unlocking echoed softly through the silent house just after dawn. Jordan slipped inside, quietly pulling the heavy oak door shut to avoid waking me. He was not alone. A short, nervous man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a digital laser measure followed closely behind him. Jordan gestured frantically toward the living room, whispering urgent instructions to the man to work quickly and quietly. This stranger was a freelance home appraiser hired out of pure desperation to place a massive monetary value on a property Jordan did not actually own. Believing that my deep silence the previous evening meant I was finally broken by his aggressive outbursts, my son had decided to push his criminal timeline forward. The appraiser immediately pulled out a heavy clipboard and began pacing the length of the formal living room. He aimed his red laser pointer at the crown molding, loudly dictating the square footage and noting the expensive custom masonry of the brick fireplace. Jordan hovered anxiously over his shoulder, explicitly demanding that the man inflate the numbers wherever possible to maximize the final equity report. He paced the perimeter of the room, casting nervous glances down the hallway toward my closed bedroom door. He assumed I was still completely exhausted from the fabricated medical drama and sleeping off the supposed sedatives. He was entirely unaware that I had been awake since 5 a.m, listening to his hushed phone calls from the back patio. I had anticipated this exact financial maneuver. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed alcove of the dining room, holding a freshly brewed cup of black coffee. I watched my son actively attempt to put a price tag on the home I had built from the ground up. I stepped out of the shadows and walked calmly into the center of the living room. Jordan physically jumped back in sheer panic, nearly knocking over a delicate side table. The appraiser froze in his tracks, dropping his laser measure to his side like a child caught stealing. Jordan immediately began stammering out a pathetic lie about hiring a contractor to fix a drafty window. I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand that the stranger leave my property. Instead, I offered the appraiser a warm, welcoming smile and took a casual sip of my dark coffee. I walked over to the mahogany console table, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I handed it directly to the astonished appraiser. I explained that the portfolio contained the original certified architectural blueprints, including detailed schematics of the reinforced foundation and the premium structural upgrades Corinne and I had commissioned. I politely encouraged him to take his time and conduct a highly thorough, meticulous inspection to ensure his final report accurately reflected the true majesty of the estate. I even offered to brew him a fresh pot of premium French roast coffee while he worked. Jordan stared at me with his mouth completely agape, his mind frantically trying to process my sudden, inexplicable compliance. He had fully braced himself for a violent confrontation or a bitter argument. By enthusiastically welcoming the appraiser and providing the exact documentation they desperately needed, I effectively short-circuited his defensive instincts. The appraiser, relieved to avoid a family screaming match, eagerly accepted the blueprints and continued his meticulous work. I simply nodded at Jordan, turned around, and walked back toward my study with perfect composure. I was actively handing them the rope they needed to hang themselves. Harper emerged from the guest bedroom just as the appraiser finished packing up his equipment. She watched from the top of the staircase as the man handed Jordan a preliminary assessment report. Jordan quickly reviewed the final numbers and let out a massive, breathless sigh of pure relief. The appraiser had heavily inflated the valuation, calculating the estate at well over its actual market premium due to the pristine condition and the upscale neighborhood. The moment the heavy front door closed behind the man, Jordan and Harper rushed into the hallway and embraced in a frantic, victorious celebration. Harper whispered excitedly that my sudden cooperation proved I was finally succumbing to the intense psychological pressure. They genuinely believed that the crushing weight of their constant hostility had broken my spirit entirely. They assumed my quiet retreat into the study was an act of complete submission, a clear signal that I had surrendered control of my own territory. Harper gloated that the old man had finally realized he possessed no power to stop their inevitable takeover. Jordan gripped the appraisal document as if it were a winning lottery ticket. His face flushed with a toxic cocktail of arrogance and deep financial relief. He told his wife that this single piece of paper was their ultimate salvation. The crushing debt that had driven them from their luxury condominium and forced them to invade my home could finally be neutralized. They stood in my foyer, laughing quietly and mapping out exactly how they would spend the remaining equity once the massive loan cleared. Their confidence blinded them to the absolute reality of my trap. They were celebrating a monumental victory on a battlefield that I completely controlled, entirely unaware that the high valuation report was nothing more than bait. Jordan did not waste a single second attempting to verify the legal status of the property deed. Driven by the blinding panic of his aggressive creditors, he grabbed his car keys and drove straight to the industrial outskirts of the city. He walked into a dimly lit, unmarked office behind a decaying strip mall. He sat across from a remarkably dangerous, violent loan shark who did not operate within the boundaries of conventional banking laws. Jordan slapped the highly inflated home appraisal document onto the scarred metal desk. He confidently presented the paperwork as absolute proof of his immense impending wealth. He boldly lied to the criminal, claiming that he was the sole heir to the estate and that the property transfer was already in its final, irreversible legal stages. Using the fabricated promise of my home as direct collateral, Jordan successfully negotiated a predatory high-interest cash loan of exactly $50,000. The loan shark pushed a heavy duffel bag full of banded cash across the table, demanding the first massive repayment by the end of the upcoming week. He made it violently clear that any delay would result in severe physical consequences for both Jordan and Harper. Jordan eagerly signed his name to the illegal contract, his hands shaking with greed as he pulled the duffel bag into his lap. He drove back to my house feeling like an absolute king, convinced he had just bought his permanent freedom. He did not know that Mr. Caldwell had already finalized the impenetrable trust protocol hours ago. Jordan had just pledged an asset he could absolutely never access to a violent criminal who accepted zero excuses. He had enthusiastically tied a brutal, inescapable noose tightly around his own neck. The heavy thud of Jordan returning with a duffel bag of illicit cash acted like an immediate injection of pure adrenaline into Harper's veins. Emboldened by this fresh, highly dangerous capital, she decided it was time to establish absolute dominance over the physical space of the house. The following morning, I heard the distinct sound of dresser drawers being aggressively yanked open and slammed shut directly above the kitchen. I walked into the main hallway just in time to see Harper standing triumphantly at the top of the basement staircase. Her face was flushed with cruel excitement as she held a massive pile of my personal clothing items Corinne had lovingly folded for me years ago. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Harper violently hurled the entire armful of shirts and trousers down the steep wooden steps. The garments cascaded downward, landing in a chaotic heap on the cold concrete floor below. She did not stop there. She systematically emptied my entire wardrobe, tossing shoes, heavy winter coats, and framed photographs down into the dark stairwell. I stood at the base of the stairs looking up at the woman who had invaded my sanctuary. She glared down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. She loudly declared that the master bedroom was officially hers, now stating that the spacious suite was entirely wasted on a man who had no future left to enjoy. She claimed the plush mattress and the attached sunroom as her rightful territory, ordering me to clear out any remaining personal effects before noon. The $50,000 of borrowed cash had completely erased whatever microscopic shred of human decency she had left, transforming her greed into open violent hostility. Jordan stepped out from the hallway shadows and positioned himself directly beside his wife at the top of the staircase, presenting a unified front of absolute betrayal. He looked down at the chaotic pile of my belongings scattered across the concrete and did not offer a single word of apology. Instead, he gripped the wooden banister tightly and delivered a chilling ultimatum. He spoke in a low, dangerously calm voice, instructing me to remain permanently confined to the basement and stay completely out of their sight. He explicitly demanded that I cease wandering around the main floor, claiming my presence was a suffocating burden on their newly acquired freedom. If I dared to disobey his strict confinement orders, Jordan promised to escalate his attacks immediately. He threatened to call the state social services department that very afternoon to file a formal report against me. He swore he would manufacture a highly convincing narrative detailing severe self-harm and aggressive dementia, ensuring that I would be forcefully removed from the premises by uniformed authorities and locked inside a sterile psychiatric facility. He used his knowledge of the legal system to construct a perfectly terrifying scenario, reminding me that a frantic call from a concerned son would always hold more weight than the ramblings of a displaced old man. He glared down at me, fully expecting me to beg for mercy or erupt into a futile, exhausted rage. He was banking on my fear of institutionalization to guarantee my absolute obedience. He weaponized the very concept of elder care, turning the protective agencies of the state into a personal instrument of psychological torture to secure his total domination over the estate. I did not utter a single syllable of protest against my own son's monstrous threats. I simply lowered my gaze, maintaining the flawless illusion of a completely defeated, entirely broken old man. I slowly descended the remaining steps into the damp, shadowy basement, my shoulders slumped in an exaggerated posture of absolute surrender. I bent down and quietly began gathering my scattered clothing from the cold concrete floor, folding each garment with slow, deliberate movements. I carried my belongings toward the small, windowless utility room located adjacent to my hidden engineering workshop. I arranged a meager living space on an old folding cot, ensuring that my silent retreat looked exactly like the pathetic surrender they so desperately desired. I allowed the heavy wooden basement door to slam shut above me, sealing my banishment. Up on the main floor, the immediate absence of my resistance acted exactly as a powerful narcotic on Jordan and Harper. Believing they had successfully crushed my spirit and conquered the final obstacle in their path, they completely dropped their guard. Their hostile paranoia evaporated instantly, replaced by a blinding, reckless overconfidence. They no longer bothered to lower their voices when discussing their massive debts or their highly illegal strategies to liquidate my assets. They moved freely through my home, leaving financial documents exposed on the kitchen counter and discussing their black market loans openly over dinner. My calculated submission had flawlessly neutralized their defensive instincts. By willingly banishing myself to the subterranean shadows of my own home, I had achieved the ultimate strategic advantage. I was now entirely invisible to them, allowing me to monitor their destructive spiral with absolute precision from below. Intoxicated by their perceived victory and fueled by the massive influx of illegal loan shark cash, Harper decided to immediately assert her new status as the absolute master of the estate. She spent the following afternoon organizing a lavish, incredibly loud celebration, inviting a horde of her arrogant high society friends to flaunt her newly conquered territory. By 8 o'clock that evening, the main floor of my home was packed with deeply entitled guests drinking premium liquor and laughing obnoxiously over the pounding rhythm of heavy bass music. The walls vibrated with the sheer volume of their arrogant celebration, creating the perfect chaotic cover for Jordan's final desperate maneuver. While Harper entertained her wealthy socialite friends in the formal living room, Jordan quietly slipped away from the deafening party. He navigated the crowded hallway and slipped silently into my private home office, locking the heavy oak door securely behind him. He desperately needed to locate the physical property deed to finalize the impending sale and satisfy the violent criminal breathing down his neck. He began frantically tearing through my meticulously organized filing cabinets, tossing decades of tax returns and structural blueprints onto the floor in a blind panic. He assumed the essential legal document was simply hidden among my standard paperwork, waiting to be stolen and forged. He eagerly pulled out a heavy metal lockbox from the bottom drawer, convinced he had finally found the golden key to his permanent financial salvation. Jordan had absolutely no idea that every single move he made in that office was being captured in brilliant high definition by the microscopic camera I had embedded in the ceiling fixture. Jordan locked the heavy oak door of the home office behind him, sealing himself off from the deafening throb of the bass music echoing through the hallway. He pulled a thick canvas bag from his shoulder, dumping a heavy steel crowbar and a cordless angle grinder directly onto the hardwood floor. He had purchased these heavy-duty tools using a small fraction of the $50,000 he had illegally secured from the violent loan shark just hours prior. He aggressively pushed the expensive Persian rug aside, revealing the combination dial of the reinforced steel floor safe bolted directly into the foundation. Jordan dropped to his knees, sweat pouring down his face as he clamped the grinder against the heavy locking mechanism. A shower of brilliant orange sparks illuminated the darkened office as the high-speed blade bit into the dense metal. He worked with a frantic, animalistic energy, terrified that Harper's wealthy guests might wander down the corridor and discover his desperate crime. The metallic screeching finally ended with a sharp snap as the heavy interior hinges gave way under the immense pressure. Jordan tossed the smoking grinder aside and jammed the crowbar into the crevice, violently prying the heavy steel door open. He let out a ragged breath of anticipation, fully expecting to reach inside and pull out the original certified property deed. This single document was the ultimate golden ticket required to legally transfer the estate, appease his aggressive creditors, and secure his stolen luxury lifestyle permanently. He reached his shaking hands into the dark cavity, completely convinced his financial salvation was finally within his grasp. The heavy steel safe was entirely empty, save for a single item resting in the center of the cold metal floor. Jordan grasped the object and pulled it up into the dim light of the office. There were no thick legal folders, no stacks of emergency cash, and absolutely no property deeds. He was holding a simple silver-framed photograph of his mother. Corinne smiled warmly from the glossy picture standing on the front porch of the very house Jordan was actively attempting to steal. Corinne had always despised flashy displays of wealth and overt vulnerability, preferring to live a life of quiet, understated strength. Decades ago, she had explicitly taught Hollis that true power is completely invisible to the naked eye. She had warned him that leaving their most valuable assets inside a residential safe, regardless of how heavily fortified the steel might be, was an unnecessary and foolish risk. Honoring her timeless wisdom, Hollis had removed the original property deed, the primary investment bonds, and all critical inheritance documents from the house many years prior. He had locked them away inside a high-security, climate-controlled vault at his primary banking institution downtown, accessible exclusively by his physical signature and rigorous identity verification. Jordan stared at the photograph of his mother, his mind struggling to process the devastating reality of his situation. He had spent precious hours and stolen loan money to crack open a sophisticated decoy. The empty vault mocked his frantic greed, proving that his father had anticipated this exact level of betrayal long before Jordan even stepped foot through the front door. The intoxicating thrill of false victory crumbled into absolute blinding panic. Jordan dropped the silver frame onto the floor, his face flushing a deep crimson as a terrifying mix of fear and fury coursed through his veins. He abandoned the ruined safe and stormed out of the home office, shoving past Harper's intoxicated friends in the hallway without a single word of apology. He practically threw himself down the basement staircase, his heavy footsteps echoing violently against the damp concrete walls. He burst into the windowless utility room, fully prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal and physical abuse. Hollis was sitting perfectly still on the edge of the old folding cot under the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb. He held a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands, completely unfazed by the sudden, violent intrusion. Jordan screamed at the top of his lungs, his vocal cords straining as he demanded to know the exact location of the physical property deed. He aggressively kicked a cardboard box across the room, threatening to haul Hollis upstairs and beat the information out of him. Hollis did not flinch, nor did he break his calm, calculated posture. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his ceramic mug, letting the hot liquid warm his throat. He looked his son directly in the eye, his gaze as sharp and unforgiving as a winter frost. Hollis stated with a chilling, unwavering calmness that the deed was heavily secured in a downtown bank vault. He explicitly clarified that the document could never be accessed, viewed, or transferred without his physical presence and his authorized signature in front of the branch manager. The stark, inescapable reality of the situation hit Jordan with the devastating force of a freight train. The downtown bank vault was an impenetrable fortress entirely immune to crowbars and angle grinders. The violent loan shark's repayment deadline was an absolute blood-soaked certainty. If Jordan could not produce the collateral or the cash by the end of the week, the criminal syndicate would not file a lawsuit. They would simply execute him and his wife. Jordan stumbled backward up the basement stairs, his breathing shallow and frantic as the true weight of his actions crushed the air from his lungs. He aggressively pulled Harper away from her lavish party, digging his fingers into her arm and dragging her into the master bedroom. He locked the heavy door and wildly explained the catastrophic failure of their plan. Harper's face drained of color, her arrogant smirk evaporating as the lethal gravity of their debt fully materialized. Jordan paced the plush carpet like a trapped animal, pulling desperately at his own hair. He frantically explained that the medical incompetency route was completely dead, and the physical deed was locked behind an impossible layer of corporate security. He aggressively declared that they were out of time and completely out of options. They could no longer play careful legal games or manipulate the old man into submission. Jordan locked eyes with Harper and swore that they had to bypass the bank's security protocols entirely. He stated that their only remaining path to survival was to manufacture a flawless, universal power of attorney document. He decided right then and there to completely forge his father's signature on the highest legal level, tying a permanent criminal noose around their own necks. The flickering neon sign of the roadside diner cast a sickly red glow against the rain-slicked asphalt on the desolate edge of town. Jordan slid into a cracked vinyl booth at the very back of the establishment, his hands sweating profusely inside his tailored jacket pockets. Across the sticky laminate table sat a gaunt, unblinking man known within the local criminal underworld simply as Elias. Elias was a master document forger, a man whose illicit talents had quietly facilitated dozens of hostile corporate takeovers and fraudulent estate liquidations over the past decade. Jordan did not waste a single moment with meaningless pleasantries. He reached beneath the table and unzipped the heavy canvas duffel bag, extracting 2 thick rubber-banded stacks of $100 bills. This was exactly $10,000 in raw cash, a massive slice of the predatory loan he had recklessly secured just 24 hours earlier. He slid the money across the table, his breathing shallow and erratic. He explicitly demanded a flawless universal power of attorney document, one that completely authorized him to liquidate Hollis's entire estate without a single restriction or secondary verification. Elias swept the cash into his lap with practiced indifference. He pulled a crisp, heavily embossed legal folder from his battered briefcase and pushed it toward Jordan. The forgery was an absolute masterpiece. It featured a perfectly replicated state seal, a fraudulent notary stamp, and a terrifyingly accurate reproduction of Hollis's signature. Jordan opened the folder, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with a desperate, manic hunger. He believed this single stack of fabricated paper was the ultimate skeleton key to his father's hidden fortune. He was so completely consumed by his own impending financial salvation that he ignored his surroundings, entirely blind to the fatal error he had just committed in a public space. Sitting just 3 booths away, completely obscured by the shadows and the scent of burnt coffee, a man in a worn trench coat calmly flipped the pages of a local newspaper. He appeared to be nothing more than a tired truck driver waiting out the storm. In reality, he was a highly specialized private investigator. Mr. Caldwell, my fiercely loyal attorney, had retained his premium services the exact moment Jordan first set foot on my property. Mr. Caldwell had anticipated my son's destructive trajectory perfectly, knowing that extreme financial desperation always breeds extreme criminal negligence. The investigator did not move his head, nor did he lower his newspaper. Instead, he angled his chest slightly toward Jordan's booth. Embedded directly inside the top black button of his trench coat was a microscopic high-definition camera lens. A silent, steady red light pulsed beneath his lapel, transmitting a live encrypted video feed directly to a secure cloud server. The camera captured every single devastating second of the illegal transaction in brilliant clarity. It recorded the exact serial numbers on the banded stacks of stolen cash. It captured Elias pulling the fraudulent power of attorney from his briefcase, and it perfectly framed Jordan's face as he eagerly inspected the forged signatures. My son was actively handing over irrefutable federal-level evidence of criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and grand larceny. He felt completely untouchable, convinced his superior intellect had easily outmaneuvered a frail old man. He had absolutely no idea that he was starring in a high-definition documentary of his own demise. The investigator quietly tapped his smartphone under the table, confirming the video file had successfully uploaded to Mr. Caldwell's private terminal. He paid for his black coffee in cash, stood up without making a sound, and vanished into the stormy night, possessing the exact weapon needed to completely decimate Jordan's life. The following morning, Jordan marched through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank branch downtown, his chest puffed out with blinding arrogance. He bypassed the standard teller line, entirely ignoring the polite greetings of the staff, and headed straight for the branch manager's private suite. He threw the heavy oak door open without knocking and slammed the forged power of attorney directly onto the polished mahogany desk. He spoke in a loud, demanding tone, aggressively ordering the manager to instantly surrender all physical property titles and to unlock the secure trust account holding my liquid assets. Jordan practically vibrated with malicious excitement, utterly convinced he had finally checkmated my financial defenses. His arrogant tirade ground to a violent halt when the high-backed leather chair slowly swiveled around. The branch manager was not sitting at the desk. Instead, Mr. Caldwell sat perfectly still, his hands steepled under his chin, watching my son with an expression of pure glacial contempt. The seasoned attorney did not flinch at Jordan's aggressive posturing. He picked up the fraudulent power of attorney with his thumb and forefinger, examining the fake notary stamp with a quiet, terrifying amusement. Jordan froze, his jaw slackening as he stared at the man who had flawlessly managed our family estate for 3 decades. Mr. Caldwell calmly informed Jordan that a legitimate universal power of attorney required a multi-step biometric verification process, a protocol he had personally designed to prevent this exact breed of pathetic amateur theft. He detailed the sheer stupidity of attempting to bypass a fortress of legal protection with a piece of paper bought in a roadside diner. The color drained entirely from Jordan's face as the crushing reality of his massive miscalculation finally registered in his panicking brain. The branch manager stepped quietly out of the adjoining file room and walked directly toward his desk, refusing to make eye contact with my trembling son. Without uttering a single word of apology, the manager took the forged power of attorney from Mr. Caldwell's hand and fed it straight into a heavy-duty industrial shredder. The loud, grinding screech of the steel blades chewing through the fraudulent paperwork echoed through the sterile office, destroying Jordan's final hope of financial salvation. The manager then looked at his computer monitor and officially informed Jordan that his internal profile was now permanently flagged for severe federal fraud investigation. He explicitly stated that any future attempt to access the estate would result in an immediate police escort from the premises. Total, blinding panic seized Jordan's nervous system. He realized the colossal magnitude of his failure. The banking avenue was entirely dead. The physical deed was untouchable, and the $50,000 he had borrowed was completely gone. He spun around and sprinted out of the manager's office, bolting through the bank lobby in pure terror. He pushed past confused patrons and burst through the front doors, gasping for air on the bustling downtown sidewalk. The moment his feet hit the pavement, his smartphone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands, staring at a blocked caller ID. He answered the phone, his throat completely dry. The voice on the other end was cold, raspy, and devoid of any human empathy. The loan shark quietly informed Jordan that his patience had officially expired. The criminal demanded his first mandatory repayment by 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. If the cash was not physically delivered, they would bypass the house and come directly for Harper. Jordan dropped the phone, entirely trapped. Jordan's frantic retreat from the bank left him with only 48 hours before his Friday afternoon deadline. Operating entirely on blind panic and the terrifying reality of his impending execution, he turned his attention to the absolute bottom of the local real estate market. He bypassed legitimate brokers entirely and contacted a shady, all-cash property investor known for buying distressed estates with 0 questions asked. Jordan brought the man a heavy-set opportunist named Miller, who reeked of cheap cologne and cheap cigars, directly to the house on a bright Thursday morning. Jordan carried a sleek leather folder tucked firmly under his arm containing a second set of hastily forged legal documents. This time he had fabricated a complete quitclaim deed intending to sign the property directly over to Miller for a fraction of its true market value just to get the cash to pay off the loan sharks. Jordan led the investor up the paved driveway, pointing out the original brickwork and the expensive slate roofing. He spoke rapidly, sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt, desperate to close the illicit transaction right there on the front steps. He promised Miller an immediate transfer of the title and a massive financial discount if the man could produce a wire transfer by the end of the business day. Miller surveyed the sprawling estate with a greedy, calculating gaze, clearly recognizing the immense profit margin staring him right in the face. He demanded to see the interior and verify the legal paperwork before calling his bank. Jordan eagerly unzipped the folder, ready to present his freshly manufactured lies, completely unaware that I had been silently watching their arrival from the living room window. The trap was perfectly set, and I walked out the front door to spring it. I stepped out onto the front porch, holding a coiled green garden hose, perfectly playing the role of a harmless, slightly confused elderly homeowner tending to his lawn. I ambled down the brick pathway with a warm, welcoming smile, extending my free hand to the heavy-set investor. Jordan physically tensed, his eyes widening in sheer panic as I cheerfully introduced myself as Jordan's father. Before my son could aggressively interrupt or try to push me back inside the house, I turned my attention entirely to Miller. I adopted a highly conversational, rambling tone, complimenting Jordan for finally bringing a professional contractor to look at the property. I casually patted the brick facade and told Miller it was a wonderful house, though it came with incredibly strict legal burdens. I seamlessly drip-fed a terrifying piece of reality into the casual conversation. I explained that after Corinne's brother tragically lost his home to a predatory lending scam 2 decades ago, my late wife had developed a rigorous obsession with absolute asset protection. I smiled brightly and informed the investor that she had forced me to lock the entire estate into an irrevocable federal-level generation-skipping trust. I explicitly dropped heavy, complex legal terms detailing how any unauthorized attempt to alter the deed, place a lien on the property, or transfer ownership outside the specific bloodline automatically triggered a mandatory federal fraud investigation by the Department of Justice. I cheerfully noted that the banking regulators monitored the deed continuously, making it completely impossible to sell the home without the direct, heavily audited intervention of federal magistrates. I thanked Miller for coming to look at the garden, acting entirely oblivious to the lethal financial bomb I had just casually dropped directly into the center of Jordan's final, desperate negotiation. The shady investor possessed an intense, highly refined instinct for self-preservation that had kept him entirely out of prison for his entire career. The moment the words federal fraud investigation and Department of Justice left my smiling lips, the greedy glimmer in Miller's eyes completely vanished. His face went entirely pale. He knew exactly what an irrevocable federal trust entailed, and he understood instantly that purchasing this property with a falsified quitclaim deed would directly implicate him in a massive, inescapable federal crime. He took a rapid, decisive step backward, physically distancing himself from Jordan and the toxic leather folder. Jordan frantically tried to salvage the collapsing deal, opening the folder and aggressively waving the forged papers in the air. He stammered wildly, lying to Miller that the trust had been legally dissolved and that the paperwork was entirely clean. Miller did not even glance at the fabricated documents. He shoved Jordan's hands away with a look of pure disgust, stating sharply that he did not do business with federal targets. He turned on his heel, practically sprinting back to his idling luxury sedan. He threw his heavy frame into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and accelerated violently down the street, leaving deep black tire marks on the asphalt. Jordan stood completely frozen in the center of the manicured front lawn, watching his absolute last chance of survival speed away into the distance. The folder slipped from his trembling hands, scattering the useless forged documents across the wet grass. He dropped to his knees right there in the yard, clutching his head as he let out a guttural, agonizing scream of total ruin. The Friday deadline was no longer a threat. It was now an unavoidable death sentence. The Friday evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the front yard. Jordan had spent the entire day pacing the living room in a state of catatonic dread, entirely unable to secure a single dollar to appease his merciless creditors. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy crunch of tires violently tearing through the gravel driveway shattered the agonizing silence. A matte black sedan parked aggressively at a sharp angle across the lawn, its headlights cutting through the darkness. 2 massive, heavily muscled men stepped out of the vehicle, moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency. Jordan stumbled out the front door, raising his hands in a pathetic, desperate plea for more time. The men did not offer a single word of negotiation. They closed the distance instantly and struck Jordan in the stomach, dropping him to the grass in a breathless heap. They proceeded to beat him brutally on the front lawn, delivering calculated, agonizing blows meant to inflict maximum physical damage without immediately killing him. Harper stood paralyzed in the second-floor master bedroom, peering through the slight crack in the expensive silk curtains. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her husband being violently dismantled in the dark. She pressed her hands against her mouth to muffle her own terrified sobs, entirely unable to look away from the horrific consequences of their greed. She realized with chilling clarity that their arrogant scheme had failed completely. The stolen money was gone, the house was entirely untouchable, and the lethal violence they had invited into their lives had finally arrived at their doorstep. She knew the ship was sinking rapidly, and her only remaining thought was how to safely extract herself from the wreckage. Jordan dragged his bruised and bleeding body through the front door, leaving a gruesome trail of crimson droplets across the pristine hardwood foyer. He collapsed onto the expensive living room sofa, gasping for air and pleading for Harper to fetch a first aid kit and a bag of ice. Harper remained standing perfectly still at the top of the staircase, her expression entirely devoid of compassion or wifely concern. She looked down at the battered, whimpering man she had married and saw nothing but a sinking liability. Without uttering a single syllable of comfort, she turned her back on his agonized groans and walked silently into the master bedroom. She locked the door securely behind her, completely ignoring the desperate rhythmic thumping of his fists against the wood. Harper pulled her expensive designer suitcases from the top shelf of the walk-in closet and threw them onto the plush mattress. Moving with cold, calculated efficiency, she began frantically packing her most valuable wardrobe pieces, prioritizing silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and high-end cosmetics. She operated entirely in the shadows, leaving the main overhead lights off to ensure her movements remained completely undetected by the injured man bleeding on the first floor. She knew with absolute certainty that remaining tethered to Jordan meant sharing his violent, impending doom. The loan sharks had demonstrated their lethal capabilities right on the front lawn, and Harper possessed an overwhelming instinct for pure self-preservation. She zipped her suitcases shut with a sharp, metallic click, her mind entirely focused on a rapid, permanent extraction from the disastrous marriage. Jordan continued to moan pathetically from the downstairs living room, utterly unaware that the woman he had committed federal crimes to impress was actively abandoning him to die. Harper knew that escaping town and establishing a new, comfortable life required immediate, untraceable liquidity. She left her packed suitcases on the bed and crept down the secondary back staircase, completely avoiding the living room where her husband remained incapacitated by his severe injuries. She navigated the dark corridors and slipped directly into the small storage alcove situated just off the main hallway. Her target was the heavy, antique cedar chest Hollis had brought with him from his original marital home. Harper had noticed the ornate wooden trunk weeks ago, but had dismissed it as worthless sentimental clutter. Now driven by sheer financial desperation, she grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from a nearby console table and aggressively jammed it into the brass lock. With a sharp twist of her wrist, the ancient mechanism snapped and she threw the heavy wooden lid open. Harper hastily pushed aside layers of mothball-scented blankets and vintage clothing until her fingers brushed against a heavy velvet box hidden at the very bottom. She pulled it open, a victorious smirk crossing her face as the moonlight illuminated Corinne's antique diamond jewelry collection. She eagerly scooped up the heavy platinum necklaces, the vintage diamond earrings, and the brilliant cut engagement ring, stuffing the priceless family heirlooms deep into her oversized leather purse. Furthermore, she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a thick stack of $100 bills. This was the remaining fragment of the loan shark cash Jordan had explicitly given her to hide earlier that week. Instead of returning the money to help save his life, she shoved the banded currency right next to the stolen diamonds. Harper had successfully plundered the last remaining physical wealth of the estate to fund her cowardly midnight escape. Clutching her purse tightly against her chest, Harper retreated into the downstairs guest bathroom and locked the door to ensure absolute privacy. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and immediately dialed her mother, needing to coordinate her immediate extraction from the hostile environment. When the line connected, Harper did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or emotional distress. She spoke in a rapid, hushed whisper, explicitly detailing her immediate plans to completely sever all ties with Jordan and the failing estate. She coldly informed her mother that the ambitious real estate scheme had collapsed entirely, resulting in massive unpayable debts to extremely violent criminals. Harper explicitly stated that she was initiating a sudden aggressive divorce proceeding the moment she crossed state lines. She shamelessly confessed to stealing the antique diamond jewelry and the remaining illicit cash, justifying the brazen theft as necessary compensation for enduring a failing marriage. She demanded that her mother clear out the guest room at her high-rise condominium and prepare for her arrival before dawn. Harper felt absolutely no remorse as she outlined her strategy to completely abandon her husband to the lethal consequences of his own actions. She told her mother that the violent men who had brutally assaulted Jordan on the front lawn would undoubtedly return by Friday to finish the job, and she had zero intention of being caught in the crossfire. She ended the phone call with a sharp, definitive command to keep her arrival an absolute secret from anyone who might come looking. Harper stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, thoroughly convinced that she had executed a flawless, highly lucrative exit strategy, entirely blind to the hidden surveillance network monitoring her every treacherous syllable. Deep beneath the main floor, I sat perfectly still in the shadowed confines of the basement utility room. The bright, high-definition glow of my secure laptop screen illuminated my face as I watched Harper's entire midnight betrayal unfold in real time. The microscopic night vision camera I had discreetly installed inside the guest bathroom ventilator grill captured her ruthless telephone confession with crystal-clear audio. I watched her shamelessly detail her plans to divorce my son, steal my late wife's antique diamonds, and leave Jordan to be slaughtered by the criminal syndicate. I possessed irrefutable federal-level evidence of grand larceny and criminal conspiracy. I could have dialed the local police department right then, dispatching squad cars to arrest Harper before she even reached the front door with her packed designer luggage. I chose a far more destructive, psychologically devastating path. I had absolutely no intention of involving law enforcement and allowing the justice system to handle my family's implosion safely. I carefully extracted the video file from the secure cloud server, compressing the high-definition footage into a completely untraceable encrypted digital package. I routed the data through a series of anonymous proxy servers, guaranteeing the origin of the message could never be tracked back to my basement bunker. I inputted Jordan's personal cellular number into the messaging portal and attached the damning video file directly to the text. I typed a single razor-sharp subject line that I knew would instantly shatter whatever fragile sanity my son had left. The message simply read, "Look at your wife." I hit send with a steady finger, unleashing a digital strike that would force the two traitors to utterly annihilate each other before the loan sharks ever returned. The confrontation. Jordan lay crumpled against the base of the living room sofa, his breath rattling painfully through his bruised ribs as he waited for a wife who was never coming back. The sudden sharp vibration of his smartphone against the hardwood floor pulled him from his agonizing daze. He reached out with a trembling, bloodied hand and unlocked the glowing screen. A single message from an untraceable number sat in his inbox, bearing a subject line that instantly froze the blood in his veins. He tapped the attached video file and watched in horrifying high definition as Harper stood inside the guest bathroom. He listened to her crystal-clear voice as she explicitly confessed to stealing his mother's antique diamonds and the remaining loan shark cash, outlining her immediate plan to abandon him to the violent criminals. The crushing physical pain of his severe beating evaporated entirely instantly, replaced by a blinding, venomous rage. He pushed himself off the floor, his injuries completely forgotten as a massive surge of pure adrenaline fueled his movements. He wiped the wet blood from his mouth and stepped silently into the main hallway just as Harper reached the bottom of the staircase. She clutched her oversized purse tightly against her chest, her fingers extending toward the brass handle of the front doorknob. Jordan moved with terrifying speed for a wounded man. He lunged forward and forcefully intercepted her exit, his hand clamping down on her shoulder like a steel vise. Harper gasped in genuine terror, dropping her purse heavily to the floor. Before she could formulate a single lie or attempt to manipulate her way out of the confrontation, Jordan ripped the heavy designer suitcase from her grip. With a feral roar, he violently threw her luggage completely across the formal living room. The expensive bag smashed into a glass display cabinet, shattering the shelves and scattering her perfectly packed silk blouses amidst the broken shards. The vicious argument, a massive, deafening fight, erupted instantly in the center of the foyer, completely shattering the midnight silence of the estate. The elegant facade of their luxurious, highly curated marriage dissolved into pure, venomous hatred as they viciously tore each other apart. Jordan screamed at the top of his lungs, his face contorted in absolute fury as he backed her against the ruined display cabinet. He violently accused her of orchestrating their entire financial downfall, screaming that her endless obsession with designer brands and high society status had forced him to seek out predatory black market loans in the first place. He blamed her relentless, shallow greed for the brutal beating he had just endured on the front lawn, raging that she was a cowardly parasite trying to flee a sinking ship she had personally drilled holes into. Harper did not cower or offer a single word of apology. Emboldened by her own desperate panic, she fought back with unparalleled viciousness. She shrieked that Jordan was a spectacularly pathetic failure of a man who could not even successfully execute a simple real estate theft against a frail, isolated old man. She mocked his intellect and his arrogance, screaming that he had completely botched the property takeover because he lacked the fundamental spine required to do the job properly. She laughed bitterly at his forged paperwork and his disastrous bank visit, declaring that his sheer incompetence was the sole reason they were currently facing execution by an underground syndicate. They circled each other like rabid animals, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings as they systematically dismantled every single illusion they had ever constructed. The psychological warfare they had previously utilized against me was now being deployed entirely against one another, turning the formal foyer into a brutal battlefield of mutual destruction. The confessions. Blinded by their escalating fury and the sheer terror of their impending doom, they entirely abandoned any remaining shred of caution. In their desperate attempts to inflict maximum emotional damage, they began loudly weaponizing their shared criminal history, shouting out the exact details of every single felony they had committed over the past several weeks. Harper shrieked that she was the only one who possessed the stomach to actually get her hands dirty, explicitly yelling about how she had meticulously swapped my daily heart medications for potent sedatives to fabricate a convincing narrative of severe dementia. She screamed that her pharmaceutical sabotage was a flawless masterpiece, while his legal maneuvering was a total, unmitigated disaster. Jordan immediately fired back, his voice raw and echoing down the corridor as he vigorously defended his fraudulent efforts. He yelled that he had orchestrated the entire foundation of their takeover, explicitly detailing how he had personally forged my signature on the highly illegal power of attorney documents. He screamed about the massive sums of cash he had paid to the underground document forger and the extensive, highly criminal lengths he went to coordinate the property theft. Their vicious argument spiraled entirely out of control, resulting in Jordan loudly confessing to hiring the fake home appraiser, who had initially evaluated the estate under the guise of a structural inspection. They aggressively cataloged their mutual felonies, throwing accusations of wire fraud, elder abuse, grand larceny, and criminal conspiracy back and forth across the shattered living room. They sought to perfectly balance the scales of their guilt, ensuring that if one of them was going down, the other would absolutely share the exact same catastrophic fate. Their screaming voices provided a comprehensive, undeniable roadmap of their entire treacherous operation, completely stripping away the invisible layers of deceit they had worked so incredibly hard to maintain. The final audio hook. Directly beneath the violently vibrating floorboards of the foyer, I sat perfectly still in the shadowed confines of my basement sanctuary. I did not move toward the staircase, nor did I reach for my cellular phone to contact local law enforcement to intervene in the domestic dispute tearing my house apart. I simply rested my hands calmly on my lap and stared intently at the small wooden desk positioned in the center of the utility room. Resting on the scarred surface of the desk was an advanced high-capacity digital audio recorder. I watched with profound, chilling satisfaction as the small green indicator light on the top of the device blinked steadily in perfect rhythm with the screaming voices above. The premium high-definition microphone I had discreetly installed inside the main floor ventilation shaft was performing its duty with absolute flawless precision. It captured every single shrieked confession, every detailed admission of pharmaceutical sabotage, and every clear acknowledgement of the forged legal documents. The metallic acoustics of the old air ducts channeled their furious argument directly into my recording equipment, preserving their criminal admissions in a crystal-clear, completely undeniable audio file. Jordan and Harper were entirely oblivious to the fact that their desperate attempts to verbally destroy one another were actively supplying the prosecution with a pristine, irrefutable confession tape. I listened as they comprehensively confessed to elder abuse, grand larceny, and conspiracy, completely sealing their own inescapable fate. The heavy steel jaws of my meticulously designed trap had finally snapped completely shut around them. My patience had yielded the ultimate reward. I now possessed everything required to utterly obliterate their lives, and the legal weapon they had so graciously handed me was fully loaded. The morning after their explosive confession-filled argument, the crushing reality of the loan shark's Friday deadline forced Jordan and Harper into a fragile, desperate truce. The physical bruises on Jordan's face mirrored the toxic, shattered state of their marriage, yet the sheer terror of imminent execution overrode their mutual hatred. They sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, refusing to make eye contact while frantically searching the dark web and obscure real estate forums for a miracle. Their salvation appeared in the form of a cryptic email from an anonymous corporate acquisition firm expressing immediate interest in the property. The mysterious buyer offered a direct cash buyout at a severe fraction of the estate's actual market value, promising to close the deal within 24 hours with zero physical inspections or annoying legal questions. Jordan knew selling a house locked in a federal trust was a monumental, highly illegal gamble, but his rational mind had been completely consumed by the violent threats echoing in his ears. Harper eagerly agreed to the digital proposition, calculating that even a massive financial loss would generate enough liquid cash to pay off the syndicate and fund her immediate escape. They hastily replied to the corporate entity, attaching scanned copies of their forged power of attorney and the fabricated quitclaim deed. The anonymous buyer accepted the fraudulent documents without a single hesitation, scheduling a private signing at the house for the following afternoon. Jordan and Harper convinced themselves that this shadowy corporation was simply another greedy, corner-cutting entity willing to overlook legal discrepancies for a highly profitable real estate flip. They had absolutely no idea that the mysterious buyer was not a careless opportunist, but a meticulously planted operative acting under the direct, unyielding instructions of Mr. Caldwell. The day of the illicit sale arrived with a suffocating heavy tension settling over the entire main floor. Jordan paced the hallway, nervously adjusting the collar of his suit jacket to hide the dark purple bruises blooming along his jawline. His primary concern was completely neutralizing any potential interference from his father during the crucial meeting with the corporate representative. He marched purposefully down the hallway and slammed the heavy wooden basement door shut, engaging the heavy iron deadbolt from the outside. He shouted violently through the solid oak panels, explicitly ordering me to remain perfectly silent and completely out of sight for the next 3 hours. He threatened that any noise, any attempt to call out for help, or any sudden movements would result in catastrophic physical consequences for me once the buyer left the premises. Down in the shadowy confines of my subterranean workshop, I listened to his pathetic threats with a quiet, analytical composure. I did not strike the door or demand to be released from my impromptu confinement. I simply sat at my wooden desk and poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, watching the live feed on my security monitors. I was actively participating in my own hostage situation, knowing that Jordan's desperate attempt to physically isolate me was the exact catalyst required to trigger the final phase of my strategy. Corinne had always told me that allowing a greedy man to believe he holds absolute control is the fastest way to expose his greatest vulnerabilities. By locking me in the basement, Jordan believed he had successfully eliminated the final obstacle to his fraudulent transaction. He completely failed to realize that he had just locked himself inside a brilliantly orchestrated, inescapable legal slaughterhouse. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a sleek silver sedan glided silently up the paved driveway and parked directly in front of the main entrance. A tall, sharply dressed corporate representative stepped out of the vehicle, carrying a thick leather briefcase and projecting an aura of absolute professional authority. Jordan practically sprinted to the front door, throwing it open with a wide, desperately manufactured smile. He ushered the man into the formal dining room, hovering anxiously as the representative smoothly unpacked a digital tablet and a stack of complex legal contracts. Harper stood rigidly by the mahogany table, her arms crossed defensively over her chest as her eyes darted between the briefcase and the front window. She completely abandoned any pretense of polite hospitality and immediately demanded that the agreed-upon funds be wired directly into their joint offshore account the exact second the ink dried on the paper. The representative did not react to her aggressive, highly unprofessional demands. He simply nodded with a cold, practiced efficiency and tapped the screen of his tablet to initiate the secure banking sequence. He pushed the fraudulent deed across the table, tapping his expensive silver pen against the designated signature line. He calmly stated that the corporation required Jordan's physical signature to legally finalize the expedited transfer of the estate. Jordan stared at the document, his heart hammering violently against his bruised ribs as the monumental weight of his federal crime loomed before him. He knew this signature would permanently cement his guilt, yet the terrifying memory of the brutal men waiting in the shadows completely eradicated his hesitation. Driven by the blinding panic of a cornered rat, Jordan picked up the silver pen and prepared to commit his final, inescapable felony. Jordan gripped the heavy silver pen and aggressively scribbled his forged signature across the bottom line of the fraudulent property deed. He pressed down so hard that the tip nearly tore through the thick parchment, permanently binding himself to a massive web of criminal deceit. Harper leaned over his shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged as she watched the ink settle onto the page. The corporate representative retrieved the signed document without a single flicker of emotion, carefully sliding it back into his secure leather briefcase. He tapped a complex series of commands into his digital tablet, authorizing the immediate release of the negotiated corporate funds. Seconds later, a sharp, piercing chime echoed from Jordan's smartphone resting on the dining table. He snatched the device with trembling hands, staring at a bright green notification from his encrypted banking application. The screen displayed a massive, six-figure pending wire transfer moving directly into their designated offshore account. A wave of euphoric relief washed over Jordan's bruised face, completely erasing the suffocating terror of the past 48 hours. He dropped the phone and practically tackled Harper into a desperate, victorious embrace, laughing wildly as the crushing weight of their violent debt instantly evaporated. They stood in the center of the dining room, holding each other tightly and celebrating their flawless survival. They genuinely believed their reckless, highly illegal gamble had paid off, convinced they had successfully liquidated a multi-million-dollar estate right out from under a federal trust. They had absolutely no idea that the corporate representative was currently transmitting the freshly forged document directly to the district attorney's office. Their triumphant celebration was nothing more than a pathetic, fleeting illusion, completely blinding them to the absolute devastation waiting just seconds away. Harper stepped away from Jordan, her face flushed with the intoxicating thrill of sudden, unearned wealth. She walked purposefully toward the mahogany sidebar in the formal dining room to retrieve a chilled bottle of premium champagne she had placed there earlier. She planned to pour 2 massive glasses to celebrate their brilliant escape from the violent loan sharks and their ultimate triumph over my estate. She gripped the foil-wrapped neck of the heavy green bottle, completely ignoring the bruised, battered state of her husband's face. Jordan leaned against the edge of the dining table, taking deep, ragged breaths of pure relief as he stared at the glowing digital notification on his smartphone. He wiped a streak of dried blood from his jawline and smiled, fully convinced the nightmare was permanently over. They were waiting for a gourmet food delivery to arrive, having ordered an extravagant meal to reward their criminal success. The sharp, explosive sound of heavy boots striking the front porch completely shattered their triumphant silence. The heavy oak front door was not politely knocked upon or gently opened. It was violently kicked inward, the deadbolt snapping as the solid wood crashed aggressively against the interior drywall. Harper jumped backward in pure terror, dropping the expensive champagne bottle directly onto the hardwood floor. The thick green glass shattered instantly, sending a sticky pool of sparkling wine and jagged shards across the expensive Persian rug. Jordan physically lunged away from the dining table, his immediate instinct screaming that the ruthless loan sharks had completely ignored the Friday deadline and returned early to finish their brutal work. He raised his trembling hands to protect his battered face, expecting a lethal assault. The imposing figures stepping through the splintered doorway were absolutely not the expected gourmet food delivery drivers at all. Mr. Caldwell stepped calmly through the ruined threshold, his polished leather shoes crunching softly against the scattered splinters of the broken doorframe. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering authority that instantly suffocated the chaotic energy in the room. He did not look like a man arriving to negotiate. He looked like an executioner arriving to collect a debt. Flanking the seasoned estate attorney were 2 heavily built, intensely stern federal agents. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, their hands resting cautiously near their tactical belts. Emblazoned across the back and chest of their dark navy windbreakers were the bold, unmistakable yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Jordan lowered his trembling arms, his bruised face draining of all remaining color as the sheer magnitude of his disastrous situation finally registered in his panicking brain. Harper stood completely frozen beside the shattered champagne bottle, her arrogant posture instantly collapsing into pure, unadulterated dread. The sudden presence of federal law enforcement completely paralyzed them both, instantly overriding their previous terror of the underground loan sharks. Mr. Caldwell stood perfectly still in the center of the foyer, his cold, calculating gaze locking directly onto my trembling son. Decades ago, Corinne had explicitly mandated that our family attorney design an impenetrable legal fortress around our physical assets, ensuring that no greedy interloper could ever bypass the strict federal tax codes governing the estate trust. Mr. Caldwell had honored her dying request flawlessly. He did not raise his voice or offer a single polite greeting. He simply adjusted his gold tie clip and informed Jordan that his recent highly documented financial maneuvers had directly triggered a mandatory severe federal response. The meticulously laid trap was actively springing shut around them without warning right now. The corporate representative standing calmly beside the dining table did not attempt to flee or hide his tablet from the federal authorities. Instead, he offered a sharp, deeply satisfied smile and deliberately clicked his heavy leather briefcase entirely shut. He smoothly adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit and stepped forward to stand directly beside the seasoned estate attorney. He formally introduced himself to the horrified couple as the senior asset manager directly employed by the Hollis Griffin estate. He explained with brutal, unwavering clarity that the anonymous online acquisition firm was entirely fabricated, an elaborate digital mirage explicitly constructed to bait desperate criminals. The entire real estate purchase was a highly coordinated, flawlessly executed sting operation designed specifically to catch Jordan committing severe federal fraud. The representative calmly detailed how every single electronic communication, every forged signature, and every fraudulent document they had eagerly provided was instantly routed directly to the Department of Justice for rigorous evidentiary processing. Jordan stared at the man in sheer, unadulterated horror, his mind violently struggling to process the catastrophic revelation. He had willingly handed irrefutable proof of his own massive criminality directly to the very people sworn to protect the trust. He had recklessly signed a fabricated quitclaim deed right in front of a licensed fiduciary acting under strict federal authority. The intoxicating illusion of a brilliant financial victory completely vaporized, instantly replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of a multi-decade prison sentence. Harper physically leaned against the dining room wall, her legs trembling violently as she realized they had blindly walked into an inescapable, meticulously constructed legal slaughterhouse. The representative tapped his digital tablet one final time, locking the device securely and formally handing the compiled digital dossier directly to the stern federal agents waiting patiently in the foyer right behind them. The lead IRS agent stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots commanding absolute silence as he produced a crisp federal warrant from his windbreaker pocket. He spoke with a chilling, authoritative monotone completely shattering the last lingering fragment of their delusional hope. He officially announced that the massive pending wire transfer displayed on Jordan's smartphone was entirely illegitimate. The funds had never been routed to their secretive offshore account. Instead, the digital transaction had been deliberately diverted into a highly secure federal impound account established specifically for this criminal investigation. The agent explicitly informed them that the massive sum of money was now permanently frozen, legally seized, as the primary, irrefutable evidence of premeditated wire fraud and attempted grand larceny. The notification on the screen had simply been the digital bait required to confirm their active participation in the massive financial crime. Jordan and Harper froze in pure, suffocating shock, their bodies completely rigid as the lethal finality of the trap finally closed around them. They possessed absolutely no money to satisfy the violent loan sharks who were undoubtedly hunting them at this exact moment. And they possessed absolutely no legal defense against the federal agents actively securing the crime scene. Their arrogant, vicious plot to effortlessly liquidate an old man's entire life savings had resulted in their own spectacular, unavoidable annihilation. The second IRS agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, the sharp, metallic clinking sound echoing loudly against the vaulted ceiling of the formal dining room. Jordan stared blankly at the shattered champagne glass pooling on the expensive rug, his bruised face twitching as his entire world completely collapsed. Down in the basement, I quietly unlocked the heavy wooden door, preparing to directly watch them finally face the devastating consequences of their endless greed. The sharp metallic click of the basement deadbolt disengaging echoed like a gunshot through the suffocating silence of the formal dining room. Down in the shadows, I grasped the heavy brass handle and pushed the solid oak door open. I did not shuffle or hesitate. I placed my foot on the bottom stair and began my ascent, my footsteps falling with a slow, deliberate, and heavy rhythm that commanded absolute attention. Jordan snapped his head toward the hallway, his bruised face contorting in sheer confusion as the rhythmic thumping grew louder. For months, he and Harper had watched me perform the role of a terrified, rapidly declining old man, a pathetic burden who shuffled through the corridors with a hunched back and a vacant stare. They believed I was entirely broken by grief and easily manipulated by their relentless psychological warfare. That fragile illusion shattered completely the second I stepped out of the hallway shadows and into the bright afternoon light of the foyer. I rolled my shoulders back and stood perfectly straight, extending my spine to its full height and adopting a posture of absolute unyielding authority. The deliberate vulnerability I had painstakingly maintained vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that radiated total control. Jordan physically recoiled, his eyes widening in pure terror as he finally recognized the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. He was not looking at a helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered for his assets. He was staring directly into the eyes of the architect of his total ruin. I walked smoothly into the living room, moving past the stern federal agents with the calm, precise confidence of a man who owned the battlefield. The trap was locked, and it was time to display the undeniable proof of their destruction. I approached the center of the living room and retrieved a thick, heavily reinforced manila envelope tucked neatly inside the breast pocket of my cardigan. With a swift, sharp motion, I slammed the heavy package directly onto the center of the glass coffee table. The violent slap of paper against glass made Harper flinch, her arrogant composure entirely decimated by the undeniable reality of her impending incarceration. I did not raise my voice or offer any dramatic monologues. I operated with the clinical precision of a surgeon dismantling a diseased organ. I unfastened the metal clasp and began sliding glossy, high-definition photographs across the polished surface. First, I laid out crisp, magnified images of Jordan's forged power of attorney documents, placing them directly next to verified copies of my actual signature to highlight the glaring, amateurish discrepancies. Next, I presented a sequence of time-stamped macro photographs detailing the exact chemical composition of the sedative capsules Harper had meticulously swapped into my heart medication bottles. The visual timeline perfectly documented their coordinated pharmaceutical sabotage. Harper gasped, pressing her trembling hands against her mouth as the undeniable proof of her felony tampering stared back at her. Finally, I pulled a sleek digital tablet from the envelope and swiped the screen to activate a video file. I turned the high-resolution display toward them, forcing Harper to watch crisp infrared footage of herself from the previous night. The video clearly showed her prying open the antique cedar chest with a brass letter opener, aggressively ripping through Corinne's heirloom blankets and greedily stuffing the priceless vintage diamond jewelry into her oversized leather purse. The visual evidence was absolute, entirely stripping away their fabricated innocence and exposing the naked, ruthless greed that had fueled their entire criminal enterprise. I placed the digital tablet back onto the coffee table and reached into my opposite pocket, retrieving the slim, high-capacity digital audio recorder I had monitored in the basement the night before. Jordan stared at the small black device, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths, as the realization of my total surveillance network finally penetrated his panicked mind. I held the recorder up, making direct, unwavering eye contact with my son, and firmly pressed the playback button. The pristine, digitally enhanced audio instantly filled the tense, silent living room. The sheer volume of their vicious midnight argument echoed aggressively off the vaulted ceilings, broadcasting their mutual hatred to the federal agents standing at attention. The speaker blasted Harper's shrill, hysterical voice as she explicitly confessed to replacing my vital cardiac medication, screaming that she was the only one capable of executing the dirty work required to secure the estate. A second later, Jordan's furious, booming voice reverberated through the room loudly, detailing how he had personally orchestrated the real estate fraud. He screamed his complete confession regarding the hired fake appraiser and the fraudulent bank documents, cementing his role as the primary architect of the financial conspiracy. They stood completely paralyzed, forced to listen to their own voices loudly weaponizing their shared felonies against one another. They had sought to inflict maximum emotional damage during their panicked fight, entirely unaware that they were actively dictating a comprehensive, irrefutable confession tape for the prosecution. The undeniable clarity of the recording left absolutely no room for alternative interpretations, legal loopholes, or desperate manipulation. Their own arrogant, furious words had provided the definitive roadmap to their guilt, completely sealing the airtight federal case I had meticulously built against them from the safety of the shadows. The moment the audio playback concluded, the heavy, suffocating silence returned to the living room, broken only by the sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs. The lead IRS agent stepped forward with ruthless efficiency, grabbing Jordan's trembling wrists and forcefully twisting his arms behind his back. He locked the heavy cuffs into place, loudly reading Jordan his Miranda rights and officially placing him under federal arrest for wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and attempted grand larceny. Harper watched her husband being physically restrained, her intense instinct for pure self-preservation overriding her paralyzing shock. Recognizing that the federal agents were entirely focused on securing Jordan, she slowly backed away toward the edge of the dining room. With a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline, she spun around and sprinted frantically toward the kitchen, her eyes locked on the rear patio door and the illusion of freedom it represented. She slammed her hand against the sliding glass handle violently, throwing her weight against the frame to force her escape. Before she could push the door open, the heavy wooden door of the walk-in kitchen pantry swung outward with aggressive force. Two uniformed local police officers, whom I had quietly ushered through the back entrance hours earlier, stepped directly into her path. They moved with zero hesitation, immediately seizing Harper by the shoulders and spinning her roughly against the granite kitchen island. They wrenched her arms backward, the cold steel handcuffs biting sharply into her wrists as they announced her immediate arrest for the grand larceny of Corinne's antique diamonds. Harper screamed in furious, pathetic disbelief, thrashing helplessly against the officers. The dual trap had sprung perfectly, catching both traitors in a flawless, inescapable vice of their own creation. Their arrogant reign of terror was permanently over. The chaotic symphony of clinking handcuffs and Miranda rights reading was abruptly interrupted by the cheerful melodic chiming of the front doorbell. Through the splintered remains of the front entrance, a sleek luxury town car idled in the driveway. Harper's parents stepped onto the porch, radiating the suffocating arrogance of the untouchable elite. Her father wore a tailored Italian suit that screamed generational wealth, while her mother draped herself in an extravagant cashmere coat, clutching a massive, ribbon-tied crystal vase meant to serve as a triumphant housewarming gift. They had arrived precisely on schedule to celebrate what they believed was the flawless, hostile takeover of my estate. For weeks they had actively encouraged Harper's ruthless ambition, gleefully anticipating the moment they could sip stolen champagne in a stolen mansion and toast to their daughter's masterful manipulation of a frail old man. They stood on the porch with smug, expectant smiles, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality unfolding just inches beyond the threshold. They fully expected to walk into a pristine foyer greeted by a victorious daughter who had successfully liquidated a massive financial asset right out from under my nose. They had planned a lavish dinner reservation downtown to commemorate the brutal eviction of their son-in-law's father, perfectly comfortable with the sheer cruelty of the operation as long as it elevated their own social standing. Her father impatiently pressed the doorbell a second time, his heavy gold watch catching the afternoon sunlight as he prepared to demand entry into a house he confidently assumed his daughter now legally owned. The sheer entitlement dripping from their posture painted a vivid picture of the toxic environment that had nurtured Harper's boundless greed. They were predators arriving for a feast, completely unaware that the slaughterhouse doors had already slammed shut. Her father shoved the damaged door aside with an irritated huff, stepping over the jagged wooden splinters with a look of supreme distaste. He opened his mouth to deliver a condescending reprimand regarding the state of the entryway, but the arrogant words instantly died in his throat. The crystal vase slipped from her mother's meticulously manicured hands, shattering into 1,000 glittering fragments across the hardwood floor to join the puddle of spilled champagne. They stood completely paralyzed in the foyer, their smug anticipation violently evaporating as they processed the apocalyptic scene dominating the living room. Instead of a victorious daughter holding a newly signed property deed, they saw Harper pinned aggressively against the granite kitchen island. Two uniformed local police officers held her wrists in a brutal, unyielding grip, the cold steel handcuffs biting deeply into her skin as she wailed in hysterical, pathetic disbelief. Her mascara ran in dark, ugly streaks down her face, stripping away every ounce of her curated high society elegance. Just a few feet away, they watched in pure, unadulterated horror as two stern federal agents roughly shoved Jordan against the mahogany dining table. The imposing men in the Navy IRS windbreakers systematically patted him down thoroughly, ignoring his frantic, bruised whimpering as they secured his own set of federal restraints. The undeniable presence of heavily armed law enforcement agents completely decimated the parents' arrogant illusions. They stared at the shattered display cabinet, the scattered designer clothing, and the high-definition digital audio recorder resting triumphantly on the coffee table. The pristine, sophisticated reality they had expected to conquer had transformed into a devastating, inescapable crime scene. The absolute shock radiating from their pale faces proved they instantly recognized that their daughter's brilliant financial coup had mutated into a catastrophic, life-destroying nightmare. Recovering from his initial paralysis, Harper's father allowed his shock to rapidly metastasize into blinding, elitist outrage. He marched aggressively into the center of the living room, puffing out his chest and attempting to wield his generational wealth like a bludgeon against the authorities. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, screaming that this was an outrageous, illegal setup engineered by a senile, vindictive old man. He loudly threatened to unleash a battalion of high-powered corporate lawyers to obliterate my estate, promising to sue me into absolute oblivion for daring to traumatize his precious daughter. I did not cower, blink, or break eye contact. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I stood mere inches from his flushed, furious face. I matched his arrogant volume with a chilling, deadpan whisper that commanded the entire room. I looked the man dead in the eye and systematically dismantled his pathetic intimidation tactics. I clearly informed him that his daughter was not the victim of a senile misunderstanding, but the primary target of a highly coordinated federal sting operation. I explicitly detailed how Harper had actively participated in a massive criminal conspiracy, actively tampering with my cardiac medications and brazenly plundering Corinne's antique diamond collection. I watched the color rapidly drain from his cheeks as I outlined the exact, inescapable legal reality of her situation. I stated firmly that the local police had irrefutable video evidence of the jewelry theft, while the federal agents possessed undeniable audio confessions of grand larceny and wire fraud. I delivered the ultimate crushing blow, promising him that his fiercely protected daughter was currently facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary for the severe premeditated exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. To ensure the absolute destruction of his lingering denial, I reached onto the glass coffee table and retrieved a thick stack of printed indictment papers and photographic evidence left by my estate attorney. I forcefully shoved the manila folder directly into his chest, forcing his trembling hands to accept the undeniable proof of his daughter's boundless criminality. Harper's father slowly flipped through the glossy images of the stolen diamonds and the detailed transcripts of the federal wire fraud charges. The vicious, uncompromising reality of the situation washed over him like a tidal wave of toxic waste. He realized instantly that the impending legal fallout would not remain a quiet family matter. A federal trial involving stolen diamonds, elder abuse, and forged real estate documents would become a massive, highly publicized media spectacle. The catastrophic scandal would completely obliterate their pristine social standing, instantly rendering them toxic pariahs within their elite country club circles and corporate boardrooms. Driven entirely by the exact same ruthless self-preservation that had infected his daughter, the man physically recoiled from the documents in sheer horror. He dropped the folder onto the floor and took a massive step backward, actively putting immense physical distance between himself and Harper. Harper screamed out for her parents to intervene, begging them to leverage their massive wealth to post her bail and hire an elite defense team. Her mother aggressively turned her back, covering her face in absolute shame and refusing to even acknowledge the hysterical pleas. Her father looked at the handcuffed woman struggling against the police officers and coldly shook his head. Prioritizing their untarnished reputation over their own flesh and blood, they walked out the splintered front door, completely abandoning their daughter to the ruthless, inescapable jaws of the federal justice system. Jordan's knees hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, the sharp impact completely ignored as the crushing gravity of a federal prison sentence finally broke his arrogant spirit. His hands, securely restrained behind his back by the cold steel cuffs, severely limited his movements. but he managed to shamble forward, pressing his bruised and tear-streaked face against the fabric of my trousers. He wept with a violent, unrestrained desperation, his chest heaving as pathetic guttural sobs tore through the silent living room. The polished facade of the successful commanding executive he had pretended to be for years vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, broken child facing the terrifying consequences of his own actions. He twisted his neck, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes brimming with absolute panic. For the very first time in nearly a decade, the word "Dad" slipped past his trembling lips. It was a word he had deliberately withheld, a title he had previously discarded as a symbol of my perceived weakness and irrelevance. Now he wielded it as a desperate, pathetic weapon, attempting to manipulate the deep paternal instincts he believed I still harbored. He begged for mercy, his voice cracking as he pleaded with me to call off the federal agents, to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding, and to save him from the absolute destruction of his life. He promised to repay every stolen cent, to fix the forged documents, and to completely disappear from my life, if only I would show him compassion. His tears soaked the hem of my trousers, his entire body trembling violently against my leg as he frantically tried to rewind time and undo the massive criminal conspiracy he had so eagerly orchestrated. I remained absolutely still, anchoring my feet firmly against the hardwood floor as my son wept against my leg. I did not reach down to offer a comforting touch, nor did I offer a single word of immediate reassurance to ease his suffocating terror. Instead, I looked down at him with cold, immovable clarity, feeling an immense, powerful wave of finality wash over my soul. The deep paternal bond that had once driven me to sacrifice everything for his happiness had been completely severed by his own treacherous hands. I stared into his terrified eyes and calmly dismantled his final, desperate illusion. I spoke with a quiet, unwavering firmness, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing like a finely sharpened blade. I explicitly told him that utilizing the word "dad" in his final hour of defeat was a cowardly, hollow manipulation. I reminded him with brutal precision that a true family is built upon a foundation of mutual respect, loyalty, and unconditional trust. A son who truly understands the meaning of family does not actively conspire to forge legal documents, steal a lifetime of hard-earned assets, and deliberately throw his own father onto the unforgiving streets. I detailed how his actions over the past several months had systematically eradicated any right he had to appeal to my mercy. He had not simply made a foolish financial mistake. He had meticulously calculated my total ruin, viewing my destruction as the necessary stepping stone for his own shallow success. I stood completely rigid, denying him the absolution he craved, firmly establishing that the biological connection we shared had been permanently nullified by his profound, unforgivable greed. His tears meant absolutely nothing to a man who had already grieved the death of his son months ago. I stepped back slightly, forcing Jordan to physically unhand my trousers as I delivered the final, inescapable lesson of his life. I looked down at his battered, tear-stained face and reminded him of the decades I had spent toiling in the background, sacrificing my own youth, my energy, and my personal ambitions simply to build a safe, impenetrable foundation for his future. I had provided every conceivable advantage, ensuring he had the education, the security, and the absolute freedom to construct a meaningful life. Yet when presented with the opportunity to build upon that solid foundation, he had actively chosen to destroy it. He had looked at the pristine life I offered and decided to tear it down with his own bare hands, driven entirely by an insatiable hunger for unearned wealth and hollow societal status. I explicitly clarified that I was not the architect of his current devastation. I was not the villain ruining his grand future or unfairly punishing him for a simple transgression. I spoke with absolute crystalline authority, stating that his own blinding greed had painstakingly mixed the mortar and laid every single brick of the federal prison cell he was about to enter. He had courted violent loan sharks, hired black market forgers, and actively attempted to discard me like useless refuse. I simply removed the safety net he had spent months trying to set on fire. The devastating consequences crashing down upon his head were not an act of vindictive revenge, but the pure, unfiltered manifestation of his own treacherous choices. I watched the last remaining spark of hope extinguish in his eyes as he finally comprehended that he was solely, undeniably responsible for his own spectacular annihilation. The lead federal agent stepped forward with a sharp professional command, immediately gripping Jordan by the biceps and forcefully pulling him up from the hardwood floor. Jordan's legs buckled briefly, his spirit entirely broken as the agent dragged his limp, defeated body toward the splintered front entrance. Across the room, the local police officers executed a similarly physical extraction, forcefully marching a wildly screaming Harper through the foyer. She thrashed against her restraints, her expensive designer heels slipping frantically against the polished floorboards as she shrieked obscenities into the afternoon air. The officers maintained a tight, unyielding grip, physically maneuvering the disgraced couple out the front door and down the sweeping brick pathway. A sizable crowd of curious, observant neighbors had already gathered on the manicured sidewalks, drawn by the shattered door and the imposing presence of heavily armed federal law enforcement. The affluent resident stood in stunned silence, watching intently as the arrogant abusers who had previously flaunted their stolen superiority were publicly humiliated. Jordan kept his bruised face pointed firmly toward the asphalt, consumed by absolute shame, while Harper continued to wail pathetically against the officer's tight grasp. The authorities shoved them forcefully into the back seats of two completely separate, heavily fortified squad cars, slamming the heavy steel doors shut to instantly cut off Harper's hysterical screaming. The powerful engines roared to life, and the glaring red and blue emergency lights washed violently across the pristine suburban lawns. The piercing wail of the sirens suddenly pierced the calm atmosphere, rising in a deafening crescendo as the vehicles accelerated aggressively down the street. I stood alone on the front porch, watching the flashing lights fade into the distance until they disappeared entirely, leaving behind an absolute, beautifully profound silence. The absolute silence that settled over the estate following the wailing sirens was not an ending, but a necessary foundation for immediate reconstruction. Hollis stood alone in the center of the shattered formal foyer and surveyed the physical wreckage his son and daughter-in-law had left behind. The house felt inherently violated, contaminated by months of shallow arrogance and desperate criminal greed. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, a highly specialized elite professional cleaning crew arrived at the front gates under strict, uncompromising instructions. Hollis directed the uniformed team to systematically eradicate every single lingering trace of Jordan and Harper from the premises. He watched with profound satisfaction as they stripped the master bedroom down to its bare original floorboards, completely dismantling the lavish, overly opulent aesthetic Harper had aggressively forced upon the space. He personally oversaw the removal of their remaining possessions, dragging heavy black contractor bags filled with discarded designer footwear, empty premium cosmetic bottles, and useless luxury accessories directly down the paved driveway. He hurled the heavy plastic sacks into a massive steel dumpster he had rented specifically for this absolute purge. The aggressive sterilization of the estate took the entire day, a methodical process of scrubbing away the toxic residue of two parasites who had fundamentally believed they were entitled to harvest his life. He ordered the crew to deep clean the carpets, sanitize the kitchen granite, and replace the splintered front door with a heavily reinforced solid oak replacement. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, the suffocating scent of Harper's expensive floral perfume had been entirely eradicated from the air ducts. The sprawling house finally smelled like rich mahogany lemon polish and the pristine, undeniable essence of total liberation. With the interior of the house completely sterilized and fully secured, Hollis stepped out into the crisp evening air of the expansive backyard. He walked purposefully toward the heavy stone fire pit situated at the edge of the manicured lawn, carrying a thick leather folder tucked securely under his right arm. He arranged a pile of dry cedar logs in the center of the stone circle, striking a long wooden match and watching the orange flames quickly consume the kindling. He unzipped the leather folder and extracted the arrogant typed list of household rules Harper had aggressively shoved into his hands on the very first night she moved in. He read the condescending bullet points one last time, remembering how she had demanded his absolute silence, restricted his access to the main living areas, and systematically attempted to erase his existence from his own home. Without a single ounce of hesitation, he tossed the rigid parchment directly into the center of the roaring fire. The paper curled instantly, the black ink blistering before the flames reduced the arrogant demands to a fragile gray ash. He reached back into the folder and pulled out the massive stack of freshly forged real estate documents, the fraudulent quitclaim deeds, and the fabricated banking authorizations Jordan had so desperately relied upon to steal the estate. Hollis fed the criminal paperwork into the fire pit piece by piece, watching the brilliant financial scheme dissolve into nothingness. The blazing fire provided a deep radiating warmth against the cooling night air, mirroring the profound internal warmth of reclaiming his absolute sovereignty. The physical evidence of their deceit burned brightly for several minutes, sending a plume of dark smoke rising steadily toward the starry sky until nothing remained but a pile of glowing embers. The final loose thread of Jordan's spectacular collapse arrived the very next afternoon in the form of a heavily tinted matte black SUV. The menacing vehicle idled aggressively at the edge of the property line before two massive, heavily muscled men stepped out onto the asphalt. They moved with the cold, lethal efficiency of professional debt collectors, their eyes scanning the pristine exterior of the home as they aggressively approached the wrought iron security gate. Hollis did not retreat into the safety of the house or activate the newly installed emergency alarm system. He walked calmly down the long brick pathway, meeting the violent loan sharks exactly at the property boundary with his hands resting casually in his pockets. The larger of the two men demanded immediate access to the house, explicitly stating that Jordan owed their employer a massive sum of black market cash and that the Friday deadline had officially expired. Hollis looked the imposing criminal dead in the eye, displaying an absolute lack of intimidation or fear. He calmly reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, neatly folded piece of white paper. He slid the note through the iron bars of the gate directly into the massive hand of the lead collector. Hollis informed the men with an icy, unwavering monotone that their target no longer resided at this address. He explicitly stated that the paper contained the exact physical address of the maximum security county detention center where Jordan was currently awaiting federal arraignment without the possibility of bail. Before the confused loan sharks could utter a single word of protest, Hollis turned his back on them, entirely triggered the electronic locking mechanism, and walked smoothly back toward his front door, permanently closing the gate in their faces. The sun rose the following morning, casting a brilliant golden light across the sprawling, manicured grounds of the estate. Hollis stood in his pristine, silent kitchen, the rhythmic dripping of the coffee maker providing the only soundtrack to the crisp dawn. He poured a steaming mug of rich black roast, inhaling the deep, earthy aroma without a single trace of tension clouding his mind. He carried the heavy ceramic mug out to the wraparound front porch and settled comfortably into his favorite wooden rocking chair. He breathed in the cool, refreshing morning air, surveying the vast kingdom he had successfully defended against the very people who should have protected it. The profound, agonizing grief of realizing his son was a ruthless predator had finally given way to a deep, unshakable tranquility. He had not needed to scream, throw violent tantrums, or physically threaten his abusers to achieve total victory. He had utilized their own blinding arrogance, their insatiable greed, and their pathetic underestimation of a quiet old man to completely dismantle their lives. True power never needed to announce its presence or loudly demand respect. It simply observed, calculated, and executed when the timing was absolutely perfect. The silent adjustment was now undeniably complete. He had successfully purged the toxic parasites from his environment, entirely amputating the rot before it could infect the foundation of his hard-earned legacy. Hollis took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of his dark coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest as he watched the morning dew glisten on the green grass. He had reclaimed his home, his dignity, and his absolute peace, proving once and for all that a quiet man pushed to his limits is the most dangerous force in the world. True wealth is never measured by the physical assets you aggressively seize, but by the quiet integrity you maintain when no one is watching. Greed remains a blinding poison that convinces the arrogant they are utterly untouchable, blinding them to the meticulous traps they build for themselves. When you treat family as a disposable resource, you inevitably construct your own spectacular downfall. Real power resides in patient silence and undeniable truth, proving that those who relentlessly plot in the shadows will eventually face the harshest light. Actions carry inescapable consequences, and a foundation built on deceit always collapses into absolute ruin.